Congratulations, you've just entered the royal court, a place of velvet curtains, gold-plated everything, and enough backstabbing ambition to make a soap opera blush. You're surrounded by noblemen and women who smell like rosewater and generational entitlement. Everyone's pretending to adore you, but let's be clear, if eye-rolling were fatal, you'd already be a cautionary tale embroidered into a tapestry. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The royal court wasn't just a place, it was a machine, a constantly whirring, perfume-scented blender of etiquette, intrigue, and quietly sharpened daggers. Kings and queens didn't rule alone. No, they needed a team: ministers, courtiers, advisors, jesters, lovers, enemies, relatives, and occasionally all of the above rolled into one very problematic cousin. These people didn't just exist to help govern, they existed to climb the ladder, and if that meant kicking a few friends off a rung or two, well, so be it. You walk into court thinking everyone's equal. That's adorable. At court, you'll be ranked, slotted, and sorted like Hogwarts students on steroids. Every little detail screamed your status. How many plumes you had in your hat, how close your chair was to the monarch, even how many steps you were allowed to take in their presence. Seriously, some nobles were only allowed to walk diagonally. Others had to back out of rooms so they didn't offend the king by showing him their behind. And heaven forbid you sit in the wrong chair. There were entire scandals, actual international incidents, about who got which cushion. In the French court, sitting in an armchair instead of a stool without permission could earn you exile. Imagine getting banished from a kingdom because you misjudged your lumbar support. Royal courts were the birthplace of what we now call fashion, although back then, it was more like a battle royale with lace. You didn't just dress to impress, you dressed to dominate. If your sleeves weren't wide enough to smuggle a turkey under them, you weren't even trying. Wealth was displayed on your body: silk, velvet, jewels, and enough embroidery to strangle a modest horse. But all that splendor had a purpose. Clothing at court was a subtle weapon. A two-sheer gown or a mismatched hose could ruin your reputation faster than an unpaid tailor. Everyone judged everyone constantly. It was like Instagram, but with swords and powdered noses. Appear too rich, and you were flaunting. Appear too poor, and you were pathetic. Appear just right, and you were clearly trying to seduce someone's husband. Here's a fun game. Try to spot the one honest person in court. You can't, because they've already been poisoned, or imprisoned, or forcibly retired to a monastery with suspicious speed. Court life was built on flattery so thick, it could be used as a roofing material. People complimented your wig while bribing your servant to find out your secrets. Your best friend today might denounce you tomorrow because their cousin's astrologer predicted it would be lucky. You're constantly surrounded by people who want to sit where you're sitting, marry who you're marrying, or just look better than you in brocade. Even the monarch wasn't safe. Kings and queens often became paranoid wrecks, forced to balance a room full of power-hungry courtiers, while smiling through banquets where everyone secretly hoped they'd choke on a chicken bone. Some monarchs didn't eat anything unless a trusted servant had already tasted it. Others refused to meet people without a wall of guards. And honestly, fair. Daily life at court wasn't just governance, it was performance. You had to attend banquets, participate in dances, go hawking, play cards, write clever poems, and compliment the queen's terrifyingly elaborate hairstyle, all while making sure your rivals didn't outcharm you, outshine you, or accidentally get you reassigned to a plague-ridden outpost. Conversation at court was an art form. You had to be funny, witty, and informative, but never too witty, or you'd be labeled dangerously clever. Gossip was currency, and secrets were traded like rare spices. One loose comment could lead to scandal. One whispered joke could lead to treason. Basically, it was like being on a reality show, except the confessionals could get you executed. If court was so awful, why did nobles flock to it like moths to a really judgmental flame? Simple power. If you wanted land, titles, money, influence, this was the place to be. Royal favor was everything. Get noticed by the king or queen, and you might become a duke overnight. Fall out of favor, and you might become a head shorter by morning. Even doing nothing at court was a strategic move. Courtiers practiced what was called splendid idleness, just existing beautifully, gracefully, expensively, being seen in the right clothes, at the right events, talking to the right people. You weren't just part of the system. You were the decoration, the atmosphere, the competition, and the cautionary tale all rolled into one. So welcome, your grace. Try not to sit in the wrong chair. Don't compliment the Queen's jewels too much. And above all, smile like your life depends on it. Because, well, it kind of does. Dinner at the royal court was a spectacle, a sensory overload of shimmering silverware, roasted beasts with decorative feathers still attached, and desserts so elaborate they looked like they'd fought off two sculptors and a florist. But behind all the gold-gilded opulence lurked the quiet, unspoken understanding that any bite could be your last. Because in a royal court, a full stomach wasn't a sign of satisfaction. It was a test of survival. Poisoning was more than just a possibility. It was a full-time fear with its own department of paranoia. Meals weren't merely served, they were vetted. Every royal kitchen functioned like a medieval crime lab, except the detectives wore aprons, and their only crime prevention tactic was feeding your food to a servant and watching what happened next. If they died, you skipped the entree. If they didn't, bon appetit, with a side of existential dread. And let's talk about the poisoners themselves. Crafty little chemists of chaos. These weren't cartoon villains cackling while dumping rat poison into a chalice. No, these were highly skilled saboteurs who studied venom like it was a fine art. Some mixed arsenic into wine, others rubbed belladonna onto cutlery, and the boldest embedded poison into the wax seals of letters, because nothing says "I hate you" quite like a slow, excruciating death via envelope. Royal families didn't just fear poison, they practically built their lives around avoiding it. Taster servants were a common fixture, professional food guinea pigs, who were either incredibly brave or very underpaid. These people were expected to sample every course before the monarch took a bite. If the taster slumped over face first into the pudding, that was a good time to order takeout, preferably from a monastery. Some monarchs took things even further. Ivan the Terrible had multiple dining rooms and would switch locations without notice, just to confuse potential poisoners. Queen Elizabeth I favoured alchemists and astrologers to test and bless her meals, as if poison feared a man with a fancy hat and a vague grasp on chemistry. Meanwhile, Louis XIV created an entire etiquette around his public meals, because nothing deters an executioner like 50 nobles watching you chew a duck leg in silence. But it wasn't just the food. Oh no, the real horror was that everything could be poisoned. Your wine, your roast, your medicine, your perfume, your goblet, even your makeup. Especially your makeup. Court cosmetics were basically a chemical nightmare, filled with white lid, mercury, and whatever else looked sparkly and dangerous. Nobles powdered their faces to perfection and in doing so, slowly poisoned themselves in the name of beauty. Imagine dying because you wanted your cheekbones to look vaguely supernatural, and don't think for a second that poison was reserved for enemies. Royals used it on family members more than Thanksgiving turkeys. Brothers poisoned brothers. Wives poisoned husbands. Uncles mysteriously fell ill after drinking a suspiciously spiced wine. It wasn't personal, it was politics. If a cousin stood between you and the throne, all it took was one tampered truffle and a good poker face. The worst part? You never saw it coming. There was no dramatic death rattle or instant collapse like in the movies. Many poisons of the time were slow, creeping assassins. You'd get stomach cramps, then chills, then a polite note from your doctor saying, "I regret to inform you, but you're doomed." This meant the court had to pretend everything was fine while the Duke turned green and coughed up his soul between bites of pheasant. Naturally, this led to a general atmosphere of don't trust the soup. People began traveling with personal chefs. Others refused to eat anything unless it was cooked in front of them by someone whose entire family had been vetted for 3 generations. Some simply fasted during visits to rival courts, not for spiritual reasons, but because starvation was less terrifying than stew with an attitude. The paranoia wasn't just local, either. International diplomacy often doubled as a poison poker game. When foreign envoys visited, gift baskets could contain everything from wine to warm wishes to accidental toxins. A fancy bottle of imported spirits might be both a gesture of goodwill and a test of trust, or a clever way to eliminate a diplomatic obstacle with a hangover that ended permanently. So how do you survive dinner in a royal court? Easy. you don't. But if you absolutely must eat, follow these rules. Never drink first, never eat alone, watch the servants. If they look nervous, so should you. Don't trust food that comes with compliments. And most importantly, if someone offers you a drink and winks, run, or at the very least, switch glasses. Preferably with them, because in royal courts, meals weren't just a chance to nourish yourself, they were open invitations to be eliminated in style. And if you did end up poisoned, well, at least the banquet had great lighting. You've survived dinner. Congratulations. Your food didn't eliminate you. Now it's time to do something even more dangerous. Existing properly in front of royalty. Because at a royal court, every gesture, glance, and slightly misplaced pinky finger is a minefield of potential disgrace. You thought knowing which fork to use was stressful? Try navigating a social code so complex that it makes rocket science look like hopscotch. Etiquette at court wasn't just about being polite. It was a ruthless, unspoken game of survival. The rules were designed not just to enforce order, but to filter out the weak. If you couldn't remember when to bow, how low to bow, and who to bow to, then you were clearly unworthy of breathing the same scented air as the rest of the court. And if you dared to sit without permission, social suicide, possibly literal suicide, depending on the monarch's mood. Let's start with the basics. Bowing. There wasn't just one kind. There were shallow bows, deep bows, half bows, side bows, and bows that looked like you dropped a coin, but were trying to make it look sexy. The exact angle of your bow depended on your rank, the recipient's rank, and whether or not there were trumpets playing at that moment. Bow too low to someone below you, and you looked desperate. Bow not low enough to someone above you, and you looked dead. Then there was curtsying, a graceful, knee-destroying descent into potential embarrassment. Too fast, and you looked clumsy. Too slow, and it seemed like you were mocking the Queen's arthritis. Some noble women trained for years to perfect the court curtsy, often while balancing books on their heads and trying not to cry. One wobble, one misstep, and your entire family name could be dragged through the powdered wig dust. And speaking of standing, when to stand was an entire doctoral thesis worth of rules. If the monarch entered, you stood. If they sat, you remained standing unless granted permission to sit, in which case you still stood a moment longer to make sure it wasn't a test. Sometimes, sitting down too eagerly was seen as presumptuous. Other times, failing to sit promptly was seen as a personal insult. Basically, chairs were booby traps. But let's say you managed to sit without being tackled by protocol officers. Now you had to sit correctly. Men mustn't sprawl like peasants. Women had to sit upright with their ankles crossed. Just so. Slouching was social heresy, and no one, not even the king's favourite, dared lean their elbow on the table. That was the bodily equivalent of declaring war on the concept of civilization. Now, let's talk about talking. If you thought small talk was awkward today, imagine doing it in a room where everyone is judging your word choice, volume, accent, and ability to compliment the Duchess without accidentally suggesting she's aged. Conversations were full of veiled compliments, indirect insults, and the kind of coded language that could turn nice weather today into a political landmine. Interrupt someone of higher rank. You've offended the heavens. Speak too little. You're dull. Speak too much. You're suspicious. Tell a joke? Risky. Laugh too loudly? Banished. Laugh too quietly? Rude. Forget to laugh at the monarch's joke? Unforgivable. Basically, every conversation was like walking a tightrope strung over a pit of crocodiles with powdered wigs. And if you sneezed, dear God, if you sneezed, pray you did it gracefully. A badly timed or poorly executed sneeze could derail entire careers. Sneezing too loudly near royalty was once considered a sign of poor breeding. The wrong sneeze could be interpreted as mockery, witchcraft, or insult. And don't even think about blowing your nose in public. There were proper cloths, gestures, and designated nose-blowing corners, often hidden behind heavy drapery like some shameful ritual. Dress codes were equally suffocating. You couldn't just show up wearing something nice. You had to wear what was expected. This varied wildly depending on time period and court. But some courts dictated not just what colours you could wear, but what fabrics, what cuts, how many buttons, and how long your train was allowed to drag behind you. At the French court of Louis XIV, certain laces were exclusive to people with titles. If you wore the wrong one, it was like showing up at the Met Gala in sweatpants made of crime. Even jewelry was heavily regulated. Pearls were reserved for certain ranks. Certain brooch shapes were associated with court factions. One misplaced accessory could get you labeled a traitor, a seductress, or worse, a climber. And climbing was the ultimate sin. You were supposed to rise through favor, not through fashion statements. All of this, the bowing, sitting, sneezing, talking, dressing, wasn't just for show. It was the court's way of maintaining order, pecking order, and stress-induced ulcers. The rules were endless, contradictory, and often purposefully vague. Why? Because that's how you catch people slipping. That's how you test loyalty, attention, and who deserves to breathe next to royalty. So if you're hoping to survive court life, remember this. Etiquette isn't about being polite. It's about performing an incredibly specific role in an incredibly dangerous play. 1 foot wrong, and you're not just unfashionable. You're outcast, humiliated, or possibly imprisoned for disrupting the social fabric with your scandalous choice of hat. In short, sit only when told, stand when expected, bow correctly. Don't sneeze, don't talk too much, don't talk too little, and for the love of all things regal, never, ever touch the king's dog without permission. Welcome to the royal court's favorite pastime, betrayal. Not knitting, not falconry, not even lounging dramatically by the window while pondering your greatness. No, the most popular activity inside those velvet-draped, marble-floored palace walls was plotting someone's downfall, preferably someone with more money, more titles, or a smug face that just begged for disgrace. Forget. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. In court, your friends were your enemies, just in fancier clothes and with better-smelling hair powder. The person helping you draft a letter to the king today might be helping forge your execution order tomorrow. And your cousin, the one who gave you that slightly too long hug at the ball last night, he's already drawn up a family tree where your branch mysteriously gets pruned. At the heart of it all was ambition, the court's most addictive drug. Titles weren't just handed out like party favors. You had to earn them, steal them, or seduce them into your lap. And since open warfare was usually frowned upon, except in some courts, we're looking at you, medieval Castile. Ambition had to take subtler forms, whispered rumors, strategic friendships, and occasionally framing someone for treason, because they looked at the queen's dog funny. The court wasn't just a place to be seen, it was a battlefield, and the weapons were charm, alliances, blackmail, and very sharp stationery. If someone was rising in favor, someone else was falling. It was gravity with glitter. You had to constantly calculate who to support, who to flatter, who to avoid, and who to blame. When the carriage metaphorically, or literally, went off a cliff. Family, by the way, wasn't a safe zone. It was a threat with a shared last name. Royal families were less togetherness and hugs, and more Game of Thrones fan fiction, written in blood. Brothers backstabbing each other. Sisters married their rivals for the throne. Uncles staged coups during baptisms. Children were declared illegitimate just to reroute inheritance. And yes, more than one monarch was locked in a tower by someone they once shared a nursery with. Take, for example, Richard III. He didn't just have a PR problem. He had nephews, 2 of them, in the way, in a tower. You can do the math. Or consider Catherine de' Medici, whose gift for intrigue made Machiavelli look like a clumsy intern. She orchestrated marriages like chess moves, kept an army of informants, and wasn't above the occasional well-timed mysterious accident. If you were at her court, and not part of a plot, you were either incredibly new or alarmingly naive. And let's not forget the spies. Every court had them. Every nobleman was one, or at least suspected everyone else of being one. Servants were paid extra to eavesdrop. Lovers reported pillow talk straight to the monarch. Foreign ambassadors collected secrets while pretending to compliment the curtains. Even musicians weren't safe. Nothing like a lute player who can carry a tune and your darkest secrets. Rumors were the grenades of royal politics, easy to throw, hard to trace, and capable of destroying reputations faster than a drunken toast. Did Lord Whatsit really sleep with the Duchess of that place? Did Lady Slightly Shifty say the king had a weird-shaped nose? Doesn't matter. The mere whisper was enough to poison court opinion, and once the gossip wheel started turning, good luck stopping it before someone got reassigned to a desolate outpost or developed a tragic case of falling down the stairs. Alliances were transactional and temporary. You weren't friends with someone. You were aligned, like suspicious planets, and just like planets, collisions were inevitable. One day you were sharing wine and secrets. The next, they were publicly denouncing your policies and conveniently forgetting that time you covered for them during the embroidery scandal of 04. Nothing personal, just politics. What made it worse was the fact that you couldn't just opt out. Not playing the game was itself a threat. A quiet noble, clearly scheming. A humble baroness, definitely hiding something. If you weren't aggressively networking, someone would assume you were secretly gathering an army. So even the peace-loving types were forced to fake smiles, give awkward compliments, and plot just a little, to avoid looking suspiciously innocent. Even love couldn't be trusted. Courtships were rarely romantic. They were strategic mergers with kisses. Marry the right person, and your family could leap 5 rungs up the social ladder. Marry the wrong one, and you might find yourself politely excluded from everything except the Please Die Soon newsletter. Royal marriages were chess games, not fairy tales. And don't get too comfortable, because love at court was monitored, manipulated, and weaponized. So what's the takeaway here? Trust no one. If your cousin compliments your new robe, he's probably bribed your tailor to sew in evidence of treason. If someone helps you gain the Queen's favor, they'll also help shove you off the pedestal when it gets too crowded. And if you think you're safe, well, that's when you're in the most danger of all. Because in the royal court, backstabbing isn't shocking. It's expected. It's tradition. It's Tuesday. In the royal court, looking good wasn't optional. It was mandatory, exhausting, and often slightly lethal. You weren't just judged by your words or your manners. Oh no. You were judged by your silhouette, your shimmer, your ability to wear 17 pounds of fabric without passing out, and whether your wig had enough birds' nests in it to be considered seasonally appropriate. Royal fashion wasn't designed for comfort, or practicality, or survival. It was designed for one thing: status. And the best way to show you were richer, fancier, and more important than everyone else was to wear something that absolutely destroyed your spine and slowly poisoned your skin. Let's start with makeup, the original beauty arms race. Want to achieve that pale porcelain skin that screamed nobility, and I've never worked a day in my life. Easy. Just slather your face in Venetian ceruse, a delightful combination of white lead and vinegar. It gave your cheeks a ghostly glow, and your skin the approximate structural integrity of a soggy pastry. Over time, it caused hair loss, rotting flesh, and what historians politely call a general state of deterioration. But hey, you looked amazing while disintegrating. And don't forget the eyes. In some courts, particularly during the Renaissance, women used belladonna drops to dilate their pupils, because big eyes were considered sultry and mysterious. Unfortunately, belladonna is also called deadly nightshade for a reason. Repeated use could lead to blindness, which is a very on-brand metaphor for court fashion. Beauty so intense, you literally can't see the consequences. Now, let's talk corsets. Those rib-squishing, lung-compressing cages of courtly elegance. Corsets weren't just worn tightly, they were worn competitively. The goal was to achieve a waist so narrow it made hourglasses jealous. Some women had their maids lace them in until they could barely breathe, eat, or express emotions beyond mild distress. Fainting wasn't a romantic flourish. It was the body's way of saying, "I'd like to participate in oxygen again." Corsets were especially brutal during events, like balls or state dinners, where you were expected to stand, bow, and engage in polite conversation while your internal organs slowly relocated. There are stories of women who broke ribs while being laced into a fashionable shape, only to smile through the pain because the queen might compliment their figure, which, in royal court speak, was code for, "You look like a beautiful hourglass that's definitely full of blood now." But why stop at crushing your insides when you can also ignite your outsides? Enter the powdered wig, the towering, itchy, flammable monstrosity that defined 17th and 18th century elegance. These wigs weren't just big, they were events. Some were stuffed with wireframes, fake hair, real hair, often stolen, and enough powder to qualify as a fire hazard in most modern buildings. The powder itself was a mixture of flour, starch, and occasionally scented additives like lavender, rose, or probably lead. This dust storm of vanity was applied liberally, sometimes by professional powderers, and had a charming tendency to drift everywhere. It covered your clothes, your furniture, and anyone standing within a 5-foot radius. You didn't just wear the wig, you lived inside it. Of course, with all that flammable powder and open candlelight, It was only a matter of time before wigs started catching fire, and they did, frequently. Picture a grand ball, a duke leaning too close to a chandelier, and suddenly, it's not a waltz anymore. It's a flaming aristocrat sprinting through the orchestra. Some courtiers even wore fireproof caps beneath their wigs, which tells you a lot about fashion priorities at the time. Yes, I know it could explode, but look at this volume. Then there was footwear. Heels weren't just for women. Kings rocked them too. Louis XIV strutted around in red heels as a symbol of power, because nothing says divine right of kings like shoes you can't run in. Some noblemen wore heels so high and narrow, they walked with the grace of startled flamingos. These shoes weren't designed for mobility, they were designed to show you didn't need to walk. Someone would carry you if it came to that. And accessories, absolutely weaponized. Hoop skirts large enough to block doorways, sleeves so long they dragged behind you like a bridal train of fabric doom. Ruffs around the neck so wide you couldn't turn your head without knocking over a small dog. Fans, gloves, snuff boxes, perfume vials. Everything you carried had a message. Usually the message was, I have money, taste, and no need for functional limbs. Men weren't off the hook, either. Court gentlemen wore silk stockings, embroidered jackets, waistcoats, so stiff they could double as shields, and makeup to match the ladies, blush, powder, and rouge. Because if you weren't rosy and powdered, were you even a duke? Some even glued on false moles called beauty patches in the shape of stars, hearts, and crescent moons. These little stickers were used to cover blemishes from surprise, lead poisoning. So yes, royal fashion was a performance. A glittering, choking, blistering, occasionally flammable performance. But it worked. If you looked extravagant enough, people assumed you were important. And if you looked too extravagant, people assumed you were dangerous or mad, which in some courts was essentially the same as being powerful. In the end, fashion at court was never about comfort. It was about spectacle. And if you happened to break a rib, blind yourself, or combust in the process, well, at least you eliminated on trend. Welcome to the real battlefield of the royal court. The favor game. This wasn't about military strategy, swordplay, or even fashion that doubled as spontaneous combustion. No, this was about the one thing everyone at court wanted more than gold, titles, or a corset that didn't cause internal bleeding. The attention of the monarch. Being the king's or queen's favorite meant everything. It meant influence, wealth, safety, and the power to ruin your enemies, with nothing more than a whisper and a well-timed pout. But securing that position wasn't easy. It was a cutthroat, high-stakes game of charm, manipulation, and knowing when to laugh at the monarch's joke, even if it was just a confusing pun about a goose. Flattery was the oxygen of the court. You couldn't breathe without it. And not just basic compliments. No, this was elite-level bootlicking. You had to make your Majesty's handwriting is divine, sound both sincere and slightly romantic. Some courtiers rehearsed compliments the way soldiers practiced sword drills. They knew the king's favorite poet, the queen's favorite fabric, the dog's birthday, any detail that could be weaponized in the noble art of brown-nosing. Of course, everyone was flattering the monarch. So how did you stand out? Creativity. You didn't just compliment the queen's beauty, you compared it to the moon, the sea, the dawn, or all three, while casually weeping. You wrote poems, performed dances, or had your gardener cultivate roses in the shape of her initials. One courtier once had his entire wardrobe embroidered with verses praising the king. Another named his pet hawk after the crown prince. Subtle? No. Effective? Surprisingly, yes. But flattery alone wouldn't win you the royal eye. You needed to be useful, entertaining, witty, informed. Some favorites were expert conversationalists, spinning politics and gossip into golden yarn for the monarch's amusement. Others specialized in practical services, organizing events, managing estates, or knowing which cousin had recently insulted the crown in private and really needed to be reminded of their place via politely orchestrated ruin. Then there were the more personal approaches. Becoming a royal mistress or lover was the fast lane to influence, assuming you could survive the envy, gossip, and occasional public shaming. Monarchs had entire wings of the palace filled with companions, most of whom wielded more power than half the noble council. Some of these lovers were savvy politicians in their own right. Others were charming chaos goblins, who accidentally started wars by flirting with the wrong ambassador. But even if you weren't in the royal bed, you could still climb the ranks by aligning with someone who was. Being close to the favorite meant access. Access meant information. And information, dear listener, was the currency even gold couldn't buy. The favor game wasn't just about winning over the monarch. It was about winning over the people who had already won. Of course, the court was full of people playing the same game, which meant every step up was matched by someone trying to yank you back down by your brocade coattails. Rumors flew faster than arrows. Alliances shifted weekly. A friend today could be your rival tomorrow, if they heard the queen rolled her eyes at your choice of cravat. Survival meant keeping your secrets close, and your blackmail material even closer. Blackmail was the unofficial second language of court. If someone was rising too fast, odds were someone else had a love letter, debt ledger, or scandalous painting ready to deploy. Servants were bribed to spy, letters were intercepted, diaries were read, nothing was off limits. And if you didn't have dirt on someone, you could always invent it. Courts were very open-minded when it came to creative fiction with juicy implications. But perhaps the most dangerous part of the favor game was this: the monarch's attention span. One moment, you were the apple of the crown's eye. The next, you were yesterday's news, demoted to some cold, rat-infested outpost with a title that sounded suspiciously made up. Royal favor could vanish overnight, lost to a newer, shinier noble, or simply because the king had a bad headache and decided your voice was annoying. And when favor disappeared, so did everything else. Friends stopped writing, servants got confused about your name. People who once bowed began staring through you like you were a particularly decorative ghost. In extreme cases, former favorites were arrested, exiled, or forced to retire with extreme urgency. One minute, you're seated next to the monarch at a grand feast. The next, your seat is mysteriously empty, and someone's already measuring it for a new occupant. Winning the favor game required confidence, charm, and a total lack of shame. Maintaining it required paranoia, performance, and the kind of stamina usually reserved for Olympic athletes or people pretending to enjoy royal hunting parties. You had to be always on, always smiling, always watching, always 2 compliments ahead of disaster. So if you ever find yourself in a royal court and think, "I'll just be myself," allow me to gently suggest, don't be who the monarch wants, before they even know they want it. Learn to flatter like a bard, gossip like a tavern wench, and scheme like it's a contact sport, because in the royal court, favor isn't just a prize, it's your lifeline. And the second you drop the act, we'll hope you like exile, or worse, early retirement in a leaky tower, with nothing but your memories and a very smug replacement wearing your old shoes. So you've survived the poisoned banquets, the etiquette acrobatics, and the royal favorite shuffle. You're thinking, finally, a bit of leisure. Ha! Leisure? At court? Oh sweet, naive noble. You're never off the clock. Even entertainment here is a trap wrapped in silk, sprinkled with rose petals, and possibly leading to someone's decapitation. Welcome to the royal court, where fun is mandatory. And if you're not enjoying yourself, someone might start suspecting you're plotting something. First, let's talk about masks. Courtly dramas that combined music, dance, elaborate costumes, and ego-flattering allegories. These weren't your average school plays. These were productions. Think opera meets costume party, with a dash of royal propaganda. Nobles would dress as gods, nymphs, or allegorical concepts like justice or the spirit of agriculture, then prance around the ballroom performing heavily symbolic routines that boiled down to look how divine the monarch is. And guess what? Sometimes you had to participate. You might find yourself cast as a noble stag, prancing awkwardly in tights while reciting lines in Latin. One missed cue and the Duchess playing virtue might trip over your antlers, embarrass the court in a mask, and your reputation might suffer more damage than your dignity. But if you did it well, if your performance made the king chuckle or the queen clap, you could gain serious favor. Yes, at court, good acting could be as politically powerful as a bribe, but masks were just the start. The court loved tournaments, grand, dangerous spectacles involving armor, horses, and enough testosterone to level a castle wall. Originally, they were training exercises for knights. At court, They evolved into deadly beauty pageants. You dress in personalized armor, maybe with a feathered helmet or a sash from your ladylove, and charge at another noble like you owed him money, all for the honor of making the queen faint dramatically in admiration. These events weren't just about strength, they were about showmanship. It wasn't enough to win. You had to look glorious while doing it. Your lance should gleam, your banner should flutter, and ideally, your horse should rear on command, like it was trained by Shakespearean drama students. Lose gracefully, and you gained admiration. Win too aggressively, and suddenly the court wondered if you were getting a little too bold. Bonus points if your rival's mother wept from the stands. Now, if tournaments weren't your style, there was always animal entertainment. A bloodthirsty parade of bear-baiting, bull-running, cockfighting, and other events we now categorize under "please never let history repeat itself." Bear-baiting, for instance, involved chaining a bear to a post and releasing dogs to attack it. Spectators cheered, bets were placed, and the bear did not enjoy any of this. Even kings and queens found it delightful. Henry VIII was a huge fan because nothing says God's chosen ruler like watching a bear fight for its life while you sip mead in a jewel-studded robe. Sometimes these shows were paired with music and banquets, because obviously the only thing better than watching animal combat is doing it while eating roasted swan and pretending not to gag at the smell. And then we get to executions, the ultimate in state-sponsored entertainment. These were public, dramatic, and disturbingly well attended. Executions were announced ahead of time like a football match. Vendors sold food, people brought their kids. It was a day out. If your idea of fun was watching someone's head separate from their neck, while a lute player strummed in the background. But at court, the executions weren't just public, they were theatrical. Nobles sentenced to death were expected to deliver a final speech that balanced grace, guilt, and good prose. A really well-done death speech could redeem your reputation, win the crowd, or at least convince your executioner to aim cleanly. Anne Boleyn, for instance, gave such a composed, dignified speech before losing her head that even the French executioner reportedly felt bad about it, and he was imported specifically for his decapitation skills. Executions could also be personal warnings. If someone at court had gotten a little too ambitious, their downfall was paraded with flair. Heads were stuck on spikes, bodies left to rot at crossroads, and in one famous case, a noble was dragged through the streets, while onlookers were handed pamphlets explaining exactly what not to do at court. The royal version of an HR training video. Of course, not all entertainment was violent or humiliating. There were feasts with minstrels, balls with dancing until your shoes cried for mercy, and games like chess, cards, and courtly flirtation, which was both sport and scandal. But even these were fraught with tension. Lose a game to the wrong person, and rumors might swirl that you were sabotaging their honor. Win too often, and the monarch might accuse you of witchcraft, or worse, smugness. Everything at court, even fun, was political. A laugh at the wrong joke could cost you a title. A toast given too enthusiastically could be seen as mockery, and sitting out of a dance might mean you were ill, sulking, plotting rebellion, or just unfashionably out of step, all of which were grounds for serious side-eye from courtiers, with nothing better to do than read too much into everything. So yes, entertainment was everywhere at court, but it wasn't about relaxing, it was about performance. Every event was a stage, every audience had hidden motives, and every show, from masked ball to public hanging, was a chance to rise, fall, or disappear entirely. If you wanted peace and quiet, you should have stayed a peasant. Welcome to the royal bedchamber. Not literally, unless you're wearing silk stockings and have a signed invitation from someone with at least 3 titles. This is where power wasn't just negotiated across tables, it was whispered between sheets. Behind every crown there was a trail of lacy undergarments, whispered secrets, and enough romantic entanglements to keep an entire generation of gossiping courtiers fed for life. In the royal court, love wasn't just blind, it was heavily armed and motivated. Marriage might have been a matter of diplomacy, but the real fireworks happened outside of wedlock. Kings had mistresses, queens had companions, dukes had secret marriages, princesses wrote poetry that only made sense if you knew which court musician they were emotionally unraveling over. It was a world of affairs, and not the boring kind. Some were whispered trysts in garden mazes, others were epic sagas involving secret letters, disguised rendezvous, and entire wardrobes designed specifically for sneaking in and out of places without being recognized. Courtiers became experts in non-verbal communication. A dropped glove could mean "meet me in the library." A slightly prolonged glance during a minuet, that could mean "I want to ruin your career with love and lace." Mistresses weren't just pretty faces, they were power brokers in perfume. To be the king's favorite meant wealth, titles, influence, and a private apartment dangerously close to the throne. Some mistresses could make or break ministerial appointments. Others hosted salons where policy was gently shaped over wine, and the subtle clash of egos in velvet. The smarter ones didn't just seduce, they managed. Affairs were carefully navigated diplomatic missions with corsets. Take Madame de Pompadour, mistress to Louis XV. She wasn't just a romantic partner, she was a cultural powerhouse. She influenced art, architecture, and foreign policy. At one point, she was essentially running the French state from a bedroom, with better upholstery than the actual government chamber. And yet, the moment a new pretty face arrived at court, her position wobbled like a jelly dessert at a beheading, because courtly love was never safe. Your affair could make you the most powerful person in the room, or the most vulnerable. Romantic success attracted rivals like sugar attracts ants in powdered wigs. There were always whispers. "She's getting too close to the queen. He's been seen in the corridor at odd hours. That letter smells suspiciously like desperation and rose oil." And rumors? Oh, the rumors were the lifeblood of royal court life. Affairs sparked them. Jealousy fueled them. Bored courtiers passed them along like venereal fanfiction. Who was sleeping with whom? Who wasn't sleeping with their spouse? Who had a secret child, a mysterious mole, or a bedroom that locked from the outside? Nothing was sacred, not even the truth. Scandalous pamphlets, known as libellos, were passed around like forbidden candy. They contained everything from political satire to wild accusations of incest, bestiality, or that the queen wore men's boots. One particularly vicious pamphlet claimed that Marie Antoinette had a rotation schedule for her lovers, including female friends, stable boys, and one confused gardener. It wasn't true, but it didn't need to be. Once the rumor was out, it was practically law. Even the beds themselves weren't safe. Royal bedrooms were semi-public spaces. You didn't just sleep there, you performed there. Courtiers watched monarchs rise, dress, and sometimes even go to bed. It was called the lever and coucher, morning and evening ceremonies, where nobles would literally gather to observe the royal body being put to bed, like a national treasure in a wig. Imagine trying to maintain a secret affair when there's a daily audience counting how many buttons are undone. And don't forget the love triangles, or rather, love octagons. Court relationships were rarely simple. They involved overlapping interests, rival lovers, disapproving mothers-in-law, and that one cardinal who always knew too much. People swapped partners, allegiances, and babies with alarming frequency. Some marriages were open secrets, others were secretly open. There were nobles who married one person while bedding another, and secretly writing poetry to a third, and still found time to sabotage a rival's opera debut. But perhaps the most dangerous part of all this wasn't the heartbreak, it was the paper trail. Letters were everything. Love letters, blackmail notes, poetic declarations of desire so cheesy they'd make a cheese wheel blush. These were all floating around the court, just waiting to be intercepted. A single misplaced letter could destroy careers, or worse, lead to very polite execution for inappropriate conduct, unbecoming of someone with an estate and a swan-shaped bathtub. And yet, in spite of the danger, everyone kept playing. Because at court, seduction wasn't just physical, it was strategic. A successful romance could be a power play, a survival tactic, or a last-ditch effort to remain relevant. Love was war, the bed was the battlefield, and the pillow talk, classified intel. So, if you're ever visiting a royal court and someone smiles at you a little too warmly during a lute solo, be careful. That might be flirtation, or a trap, or both. Either way, get ready for rumors, rivals, and a love life that might just make you king, or very, very single in a remote castle tower. You might think that with all their palaces, jewels, armies, and god complexes, royals would be immune to irrational fears. But no. Give a monarch absolute power, and they'll still panic if a black cat crosses their throne room. Welcome to the royal court's less glamorous, more haunted side. A place where policy could be influenced by dreams, birds, suspicious shadows, or the sudden twitch of a royal eyelid. Royal superstition wasn't just personal quirkiness, it was institutionalized paranoia. Monarchs weren't just ruling by divine right, they were constantly trying to decode the divine's mood swings. Was that solar eclipse a sign of victory or doom? Did the king's hiccups mean war was coming? Better summon an astrologer, a bishop, and probably a goat, just in case. Let's start with omens. Everything was an omen. Birds flying west? Bad. Birds flying east? Slightly better. Birds flying into the palace, knocking over the candelabra, and pooping on the tapestry? Absolute unquestionable doom. Monarchs had entire teams dedicated to interpreting these signs. Augurs, astrologers, and mystics earned royal salaries for basically being celestial mood ring readers. If you could convincingly say, "The stars disapprove of this treaty," you could sway national policy. And then there were curses. Royals loved cursing each other, sometimes dramatically at dinner, other times more sneakily with the help of dark-eyed mystics and herbs that definitely weren't in any cookbook. If a noble suddenly fell ill, lost favor, or began barking at their furniture, everyone's first assumption wasn't bad luck or cholera. It was someone cursed him. Probably that guy with the suspicious mole and too many cats. The fear of curses led to some wild precautions. Talismans were sewn into royal garments. Protective rings were worn to deflect evil energy. Charms were hidden under thrones, and every now and then someone would quietly accuse the queen's cousin's herbalist of being a witch, just to be safe. Witchcraft, by the way, wasn't just feared, it was political dynamite. If you wanted someone removed, but didn't have proof of treason, accusing them of consorting with dark forces worked like a charm. Literally, trials were held based on someone's wart placement, and whether their dog looked untrustworthy. It wasn't uncommon for entire courts to go through witch-hunting phases where nobles were suddenly very concerned about that one time. Lady Aldergrove sneezed during a lightning storm. Even the dead got in on the action. Ghost stories were rampant in royal circles, and not just "I heard something in the hall" type ghost stories. No, we're talking full-blown hauntings with reputations. Certain castles had rooms that no servant would enter after dusk. Thrones were said to be cursed by the spirits of wrongly executed nobles. Entire dynasties believed they were haunted by the ghosts of rivals past, who showed up in dreams, mirrors, and the occasional mid-feast possession. Take, for example, the infamous Tower of London, where numerous royals were imprisoned, executed, and allegedly now roam the halls like very well-dressed phantoms. Anne Boleyn's ghost reportedly appears holding her own head. Classic Tudor drama. Some guards have quit after late-night sightings, and more than one monarch flat-out refused to stay there overnight, despite it being one of the most fortified locations in the kingdom. Ghost-proof? Maybe. Ghost-inviting? Absolutely. Even crowns weren't safe from superstition. Some royal regalia was believed to be cursed. If a certain scepter fell from its display, it meant disaster. If a crown jewel went missing, or even looked duller than usual, court astrologers were called in. Monarchs would delay coronations, reschedule invasions, or even fire half the treasury staff based on the mood of a diamond. Astrology in particular had a VIP pass to the throne room. Birth charts were drawn up for royal babies within hours of their arrival. Wars were declared based on planetary alignment. Weddings were postponed because Venus was in retrograde. If Mercury was misbehaving, it wasn't just your carriage breaking down, it was probably the reason your allies betrayed you and your wig caught fire at the masquerade. Some rulers took it even further. Emperors in China and Rome had entire celestial bureaucracies to track the heavens. Mongol leaders reportedly made sacrifices before battles to appease local spirits. Tansars consulted holy fools and mystics who spoke in riddles and sometimes lived in barrels for dramatic flair. The French royal court had astrologers on permanent retainer, with special horoscopes commissioned before major decisions, because if you're going to tax your peasants into oblivion, you should at least check with the moon first. But perhaps the most ironic part? The more powerful the monarch, the more terrified they seemed to be of invisible forces. They could command armies but feared dreams about wolves. They could exile rivals but panicked if someone dropped a spoon during a thunderstorm. Power didn't protect them from paranoia, it amplified it. When everyone's gunning for your throne, even a crooked portrait feels like a spiritual threat. So if you're ever invited to a royal court and hear someone whisper, "The cat sneezed thrice under a full moon." Don't laugh. That sneeze might cancel a treaty, get someone fired, or start a war. Or it might just mean the cat has a cold. Either way, best to nod solemnly and sacrifice a candle, just in case. So you've made it this far. You survived the poisoned wine, the flaming wigs, the backstabbing cousins, the scandalous love triangles, and even the ghost of that duchess who allegedly still haunts the royal bedchamber. You danced the masks, flattered the monarch, curtsied at the right angle, and managed to keep your corset from puncturing a lung. Congratulations. Now it's time to fall, because in the royal court, the only thing more dramatic than rising to power is plummeting from it. Let's start with the basics. You're never safe. Not even when the king swears you're like a brother. Especially not then. Monarchs were notoriously fickle. One moment, you're the jewel of the court, being gifted a gold-plated hunting falcon and serenaded at dinner. The next, you're under house arrest in a leaky tower that smells like damp betrayal, and the causes. Oh, they were gloriously petty. A bad joke at a banquet, an outfit that clashed with the queen's drapes, laughing too hard when the prince tripped over his dog, or worse, not laughing at the queen's joke, which she definitely workshopped with her chambermaids for 3 days. The margin for error, razor thin. The consequences, absolutely massive. When the crown turned on you, it did not send a strongly worded letter, it sent silence. Suddenly, people stopped making eye contact. Your usual seat at the royal table, occupied by that smirking baron whose compliments always sound like insults. Your servants forget your name. Your invitations stop arriving. The court musicians stop playing your favorite lute solo and start tuning aggressively whenever you enter a room. And then, the rumors begin. They don't accuse you outright. That would be too easy. No, they suggest. He's been quiet lately. She's spending too much time with the astrologer. Did you see the way he frowned during mass? Boom. Heretic. Traitor. Seducer of pigeons. Whatever sticks. The goal isn't truth. It's removal. And once the whispers reach the monarch's ear, your fate is no longer yours. Let's look at some historical examples, because royal courts were practically powered by these downfalls. Take Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's fixer, and most loyal ladder climber. For years, he orchestrated Henry's dirty work with ruthless efficiency. Then he arranged a politically advantageous marriage to Anne of Cleves. Henry found her underwhelming. Cromwell was executed. Just like that, thanks for the treason help, here's your severed head. Or consider Empress Dowager Lu of Han China. She wielded power behind the scenes for years. But after her death, every member of her family was rounded up and executed so thoroughly, it was like the court hit undo on her entire lineage. Because here's the royal truth. When the crown tires of you, it wipes you away like a wine stain on silk. Fast, brutal, thorough. Exile was the gentle version. You'd be banished to the countryside, technically alive, but surrounded by sheep, scandal, and the crushing knowledge that someone else is sitting in your old chair, wearing your perfume, and definitely taking credit for your idea to make court gowns 10% fluffier. Execution? Also common, but only if the monarch needed to make a point. You'd be hauled out for a very public and extremely polite trial. The verdict would be decided before you opened your mouth, and then, whoosh, your head's rolling, your enemies are applauding, and your portrait gets mysteriously removed from the banquet hall. But for the truly unlucky, there was the accident. You tripped on the stairs, you caught a fever, you fell out of a palace window that just happened to be 20 stories up, and directly above a suspiciously placed spear. Everyone nods solemnly and pretends not to remember that the king once muttered, "He's becoming a nuisance," while cutting his pheasant. And the court moves on instantly. They've seen this before. One day you're toasting at the king's side. The next, your former friends are trying not to use your name too loudly, just in case someone decides to test the trapdoor mechanism again. But perhaps the worst part? The way history forgets you. Or worse, remembers you incorrectly. Suddenly the records say you were unstable, ambitious, possibly involved in dark rituals. Never mind that you were the architect of 5 peace treaties, 3 palaces, and the royal dog park. You're now officially a cautionary tale. So how do you avoid falling from grace? You don't. That's the twist. The royal court was a game you couldn't win, only delay losing. The moment you stepped into its glittering halls, you began a slow-motion duel with fate. All you could do was play smart, bow low, compliment everyone, and never forget that the same hand that lifted your chin today might shove you off a cliff tomorrow. The crown giveth, and the crown absolutely snatcheth away. Once upon a time, because yes, this story begins like a fairy tale, though it ends in fire and blood, there was a wedding. But not just any wedding. This was a divine celebration, a mythic bash thrown for the union of Peleus, a mortal hero and prince, and Thetis, a sea goddess known for beauty, shape-shifting, and turning men down flat. Fun fact, Zeus once had a thing for Thetis, but backed off when he heard a prophecy that her son would be greater than his father. For an immortal king with chronic paranoia and way too many children, that was a hard no. So Thetis was paired off with a mortal instead. Problem solved. Narrator voice. It was not. The wedding took place on Mount Pelion and had everything: ambrosia, nectar, divine drama, and at least one future world-ending mistake. Every major god and goddess showed up. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Apollo, even Dionysus, who probably brought enough wine to drown a centaur. It was the Met Gala of Olympus. Everyone who was anyone got an invite. Everyone except one. Enter Eris, the goddess of discord, and not metaphorically. Her entire brand was stirring chaos, like it's a shaken martini. Now, if you were throwing a wedding, you'd understand why you'd maybe forget to invite someone whose idea of fun is lighting metaphorical and sometimes literal fires. But when Eris found out she'd been snubbed, she did what any chaos deity with abandonment issues would do. She showed up anyway, and she brought a gift. Not a toaster, not a fruit basket, a golden apple, but not just any golden apple. This one was engraved with the words "To the fairest," which, to be fair, is a bold move at a party where every single goddess thinks she's the main character. What followed was the divine equivalent of 3 fashion influencers brawling over a beauty award. Hera, queen of the gods and certified power wife. Athena, goddess of wisdom, war, and winning. And Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and awkward relationship choices, all claimed the apple was meant for them. Now, if you're wondering why Zeus didn't step in, it's because he had the ancient wisdom to say, nope. He punted the problem faster than you can say, not my circus, not my furies. Instead, he assigned the task of judging the most dangerous beauty pageant in mythological history to a young Trojan prince named Paris, a shepherd by disguise, but royalty by blood. And that's when things really started going sideways. Paris wasn't chosen because of his political savvy or crisis management skills. He was picked because he was technically neutral and conventionally attractive, sort of like asking a golden retriever to referee a bar fight. What Paris didn't know was that each goddess came bearing a bribe. The ancient Greek version of backstage lobbying. Hera offered him power, kingship over all of Asia. Athena promised him wisdom and military glory. He'd never lose a battle. Aphrodite simply offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. And Paris, true to the heart and other organs of a man with questionable judgment, picked Aphrodite. The apple was hers. That decision, dear listener, was the cosmic equivalent of lighting a match in a fireworks factory. Sure, it seemed harmless in the moment, but the woman Aphrodite promised wasn't single. In fact, she was very married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Her name, Helen, and she would soon be the spark for the most infamous war in ancient myth. But we're not there yet. Let's just take a moment to appreciate what just happened. A goddess with a grudge wasn't invited to a party, so she threw a divine tantrum that started an argument between 3 other goddesses, who then dragged a mortal into it, who made a shallow decision based on looks, which eventually led to the deaths of thousands, the destruction of Troy, and a 10-year war, all because someone didn't want to deal with Eris at the buffet table. If you ever feel like your family drama ruins a holiday gathering, just remember this wedding set the bar. It turned a celebration into a centuries-echoing catastrophe. Talk about you had to be there. So what have we learned? Always invite the goddess of discord to your party, or at least send a nice fruit basket with an apology note. Never ask a pretty shepherd to make important decisions between immortal women. Just don't. And never underestimate the power of a shiny apple with bad intentions, because when the gods throw shade, mortals bleed. If you've ever made a bad decision on vacation, say, accidentally adopted a stray dog, maxed out your credit card, or drunkenly bought a timeshare, just know that Paris, Prince of Troy, has you beat. Because when he went abroad, he didn't just bring back some cheap souvenirs, he brought home a queen. Let's back up. Paris, still glowing with confidence after being declared the world's best judge of goddess beauty, because that's a thing, was sent on a diplomatic mission to Sparta, home of Menelaus, king, warrior, redhead, and proud husband of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. A woman whose face, according to poets, launched 1,000 ships. Romantic, sure, but also the ancient Greek way of saying, this girl caused a whole naval apocalypse. Now here's the kicker. Paris wasn't there to cause trouble. In fact, he was sent to patch things up between Troy and Sparta, a goodwill tour, smile, wave, maybe toast some wine and avoid getting stabbed. Instead, he walked into a royal palace, met the queen and said, hello, you're pretty. I have a goddess on speed dial, and I think we should make questionable choices together. And somehow, it worked. Here's where the story splits between versions, because Greek mythology never settles for just one plot line, when it can have 3 conflicting ones. In one version, Helen fell madly in love with Paris, courtesy of Aphrodite's divine matchmaking. In another, Paris abducted her. In yet another, Helen didn't resist, but she definitely didn't RSVP to eternal war either. Whichever version you prefer, the facts are these. Menelaus left town for a bit, and when he came back, his wife and a significant portion of his dignity were gone. Paris, our prince of poor decisions, didn't just flee the scene quietly, no. He set sail from Sparta with Helen, some stolen Spartan treasures because, sure, why not rob the guy you just cuckolded? And the general attitude of a man who thought, what could go wrong, was a rhetorical question. And this is where things go from awkward to apocalyptic, because Menelaus wasn't just any jilted husband, he was a Greek king. And if there's one thing Greek kings hated more than being humiliated, it was being humiliated by a foreigner who looked like a shampoo commercial. So Menelaus did what any reasonable ancient monarch would do. He called in a war coalition, and not just any war coalition. He summoned every major Greek leader who had ever sworn an oath to protect Helen's marriage, which, by the way, was something they had literally done years before when she was choosing a husband. They didn't think the oath would ever actually be enforced. Joke's on them. Suddenly, this wasn't just personal, it was national. It was geopolitical heartbreak with bronze armor and bad blood. Agamemnon, Menelaus's big brother, and a man who looked at war the way toddlers look at crayons, must use all of them immediately, jumped at the chance to command the greatest military expedition Greece had ever seen. He had ambition, pride, and a suspicious lack of hobbies. Meanwhile, other kings and warlords were being roped in like it was a Bronze Age group project, with deadly consequences. Nestor, the wise elder who had probably seen 12 wars too many. Ajax the Greater, who could bench press a chariot. Diomedes, whose hobby was stabbing things really well. Odysseus, who pretended to be insane to avoid joining. But the star of this angry alliance was still Helen, who was now chilling in Troy with Paris, awkwardly aware that an entire continent was on its way to kill for her, or kill because of her. Either way, she wasn't getting peace and quiet. And Paris? Oh, Paris. He might have been beautiful, charming, and draped in God-blessed confidence, but what he wasn't was a man who had thought anything through. His diplomatic mission had turned into a grand theft wife, and instead of smoothing over tensions, he lit the biggest fuse in mythological history. Let's be clear, Paris wasn't brave. He was just hot, and had zero concept of consequences. The man ran a cost-benefit analysis and thought, eternal war sounds like a fair price for a romantic weekend. The result? A coalition of furious Greeks, thousands of warships, and the beginning of what would become a 10-year siege soaked in blood, drama, and divine sabotage. And all of it, because one man couldn't just admire Helen politely and go home. So if you're keeping score at home, diplomacy failed, marriage vows shattered, international relations obliterated, and nobody even got a refund on the wedding gift. This was no longer just a myth. It was a slow-motion disaster wrapped in ego, fueled by lust, and sponsored by really poor impulse control. Now that Menelaus and Agamemnon had declared war over a stolen wife, the next step was simple: Assemble the most unhinged team of warriors Greece had ever known. Think Ocean's 11, but with more yelling, fewer suits, and a lot more stabbing. Oh, and one guy in drag. Because this wasn't just war, this was the Super Bowl of Greek masculinity, and every city-state with a sword and a grudge wanted in. But not all heroes came running. In fact, two of the most important ones had to be tricked, dragged, or coerced into battle, because of course they did. Let's start with Odysseus. You'd think a guy famous for clever plans and eloquent speeches would be eager to fight for glory. Nope, Odysseus had one goal: stay home. He had a wife he actually liked, Penelope, a newborn son, Telemachus, and zero interest in dying in someone else's marital drama. So when the Greek recruiters came knocking, Odysseus did the only logical thing. He pretended to be insane, and not just talking to yourself on the beach, insane, ploughing his fields with salt, insane. He yoked up a donkey and an ox, already suspicious, started sowing salt instead of seeds, and mumbled gibberish like a man whose brain had fully unplugged. Frankly, it was Oscar-worthy. Ancient Greek Hollywood would have thrown statues at him, but then, wily Greek recruiter Palamedes, who could smell fake madness like a bloodhound, decided to test him. He placed baby Telemachus right in front of the plough. Odysseus stopped immediately. Boom. Sanity exposed. Fatherhood. 1. Fake breakdown. 0. With the jig up, Odysseus was strong-armed into service. And yes, he held a grudge. We'll get back to that after the war. Spoiler, it ends badly for Palamedes. Next up, Achilles. Now Achilles was the guy. He wasn't just a hero, he was a weapon with feelings. The son of the sea goddess Thetis and the mortal Peleus. Remember them from the Wedding of Doom in Chapter 1. Achilles had been dunked in the river Styx as a baby to make him invincible, except for that one pesky heel which his mom had held him by. But Achilles wasn't just strong, he was fast, beautiful, angry, and had the emotional stability of a thunderstorm. Everyone knew he'd be vital in the war effort. Problem was, Thetis didn't want her baby anywhere near it, so what did she do? She hid him on the island of Syros, disguised as a girl. Let that sink in. The most dangerous warrior in the Greek world spent his teenage years cross-dressing among royal daughters, pretending to be one of the ladies while playing the lyre and doing embroidery. Achilles in drag, Achilles in braids, Achilles, the slayer of men, blending in with girls who were probably just wondering why the new one could bench press a horse. Enter Odysseus, fresh off being outed as sane and ready for revenge in the form of forced recruitment. He knew where Achilles was hiding, and devised a plan that involved a trunk full of weapons, jewelry, and maybe a few spicy bugles for dramatic effect. Disguised as a merchant, Odysseus laid out trinkets and girly gifts, silk, mirrors, perfumes, right next to a shiny set of swords and shields. Then he made some noise, stage whispered about an enemy raid, and waited. Sure enough, one of the girls lunged for the weapons like a kid, grabbing the last slice of pizza. Achilles blew his own cover in 5 seconds flat. So much for subtlety. And that was that. Achilles was in, whether he liked it or not. As the Greek alliance started forming, other heroes were roped in too, each one a unique disaster. Ajax the Greater, massive, muscle-bound, and approximately as subtle as a battering ram. Perfect for breaking things, not so great at social nuance. Ajax the Lesser, fast and flashy, but with the personality of a drunken frat bro. Trust us, he will be a problem later. Diomedes, young, deadly, and dangerously ambitious, also once stabbed Ares, the literal god of war, because Diomedes does not care for the rules. Nestor, old, wise, and there to deliver exposition in long, slightly tedious monologues. Menetheius, Idomeneus, Protesilaus, each brought a ship, a squad, and just enough ego to sink a trireme. It was the Avengers of ancient ego. Every warrior with a sword and a myth attached to their name came strutting into the Greek camp, ready to settle scores, pose for statues, and leave behind some poetic tragedy. The Greeks didn't just assemble an army, they assembled a time bomb of clashing personalities, grudges, ambitions, and unresolved mother issues. But hey, when you're going to war over a runaway queen and a golden apple, why not bring a guy who once stabbed a god, and another who had to be blackmailed out of drag? This wasn't just a war effort, it was a group therapy session with swords. And as they set sail, full of hope, testosterone, and no long-term plan, The only thing everyone could agree on was this: it was going to be messy. If you thought the humans were messy in this war, just wait until we talk about the gods. You'd think that immortals, cosmic beings with millennia of wisdom, power over the natural world, and front-row seats to the history of humanity, would rise above petty grudges. But no, absolutely not. The Olympians treated the Trojan War like their own personal reality show, and the stakes were bragging rights, bruised egos, and occasionally turning people into trees for fun. Let's set the scene. The war is about to begin. Armies are mobilizing. Ships are launching. And up on Mount Olympus, the gods are forming teams. This wasn't about morals. This wasn't about justice. This was about who liked who owed favors, and who hadn't gotten over that one snub at a party 3 centuries ago. Why were they pro-Greek? Simple. Athena and Hera were still fuming from that whole golden apple incident, where Paris, that shampoo commercial prince from chapter 2, declared Aphrodite the fairest of them all. Hera, queen of the gods, was not used to rejection, and Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, was not used to losing anything, including divine beauty contests. So their reasoning was, oh, Paris likes Trojans. Great. Let's destroy them. Poseidon joined in partly because the Greeks were seafaring people, and he liked being relevant, but also because he held a grudge against the Trojans for not paying him for a construction job. That's right. The god of earthquakes went to war over unpaid labor. Poseidon built Troy's walls. The Trojans stiffed him, and he's been holding that invoice ever since. Honestly, understandable. Aphrodite, of course, was backing the Trojans. Her golden boy Paris picked her as the hottest goddess, and she rewarded him with Helen, which, in retrospect, is like giving someone a live grenade with a gift bow. She wasn't going to let her trophy boy lose a war that would reflect badly on her brand. Apollo, the god of music, plague, archery, and attractive chaos, supported the Trojans, mostly because he liked Hector and didn't like the Greeks' general vibe. Also, a Greek priest had recently insulted one of his temples, so Apollo sent a plague to their camp, because that's how gods say, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed, and also, here's some death. Ares, the god of war, was, well, Ares was wherever the action was. He technically backed the Trojans, but his loyalty changed hourly based on who looked cooler, who had better armor, or who insulted him less that morning. Think of Ares as the war god equivalent of a sports fan who switches jerseys mid-game because the snacks are better on the other side. Then there's Zeus, king of the gods, storm hurler, and serial dad. He claimed neutrality, which in divine terms meant meddling constantly, and then pretending to be impartial. Zeus didn't want to take sides, at least officially, but he also couldn't resist sticking his lightning bolt into the drama. He'd drop cryptic omens cause a storm just to delay ships, or send dreams to people encouraging them to make terrible decisions. Basically, he was the chaotic dungeon master of the war. Never on the field, always behind the madness. And let's not forget, he still had to keep his divine household from murdering each other. Hera was scheming. Athena was vengeful. Aphrodite was seductive and smug. Zeus mostly tried to keep the peace by hurling threats, and occasionally seducing someone to change the subject. The divine meddling wasn't just strategic, it was insanely petty. Gods would literally swoop down onto the battlefield, invisibly bonk someone on the head, or whisper into a general's ear, like ancient celestial influencers. Sometimes they disguised themselves as mortals, sometimes they just didn't bother, and showed up glowing like metaphysical light bulbs. A few highlights. Athena once tricked a Trojan into breaking a truce by impersonating another soldier and whispering, "Hey, throw a spear, it'll be fun." Apollo guided Paris's arrow directly into Achilles' heel. Yes, that heel. Hera seduced Zeus mid-war to distract him from interfering, which is possibly the most ambitious battlefield maneuver ever attempted with lingerie. Each time the mortals tried to make progress, the gods hit reset. It was like playing a board game with toddlers who kept flipping the table. Peace talks, sabotaged, ceasefires, ruined. Strategic decisions, reversed by a thunderclap and a divine tantrum. That's the real tragedy of the Trojan War. It wasn't just fought by men, it was manipulated by immortals with zero accountability. Imagine fighting in a war where your general is taking orders from a dream he thinks came from Zeus. Your enemy is getting shielded by a goddess who has a crush on him. And every time things calm down, someone upstairs decides it's time for another episode of Godly Interference, War Edition. It wasn't just a battlefield, it was a cosmic game board. And the mortals, just the pawns with excellent cheekbones and very short life expectancies. And as the war dragged on, one thing became clear. The gods weren't trying to help, they were just trying to win their arguments. Which, in the end, made everything so much worse. When the Greeks first arrived on the shores of Troy, they came with swords, egos, and wildly unrealistic expectations. Like all good military catastrophes, someone probably said, "Don't worry, we'll be home by the end of summer." Fast forward 10 years, and the only thing that had gone home was their patience. The Trojan War didn't start with one grand, sweeping battle. It started with a lot of shouting, some awkward speeches, and a bloody welcome committee. When the Greeks landed, they weren't met with open arms or even a half-decent harbour. They were greeted by Trojan defenders, ready to turn the beach into a charred mess of spears and regret. And yet, somehow, the Greeks held their ground, built some tents, and settled in for what they assumed would be a swift conquest. But then they saw the walls. Troy wasn't some sleepy coastal town with picket fences and friendly farmers. It was a fortified city, with walls built by actual gods, Poseidon and Apollo, back when they did construction gigs during their divine sabbatical. These weren't your run-of-the-mill stone barriers. These were walls that laughed at battering rams. Walls that made Greek soldiers seriously reconsider their life choices. These were the kind of walls that made siege warfare feel like trying to break into a bank vault using a spoon. So Plan A, attack the city directly, turned into Plan B. Wait it out, and hope they get bored. Thus began the 10-year stalemate, where the Greeks camped outside the city like the world's worst Airbnb guests, and the Trojans peered from above, hoping the invaders would eventually just go away. It didn't help that the Greeks weren't exactly united. With dozens of kings, each leading their own contingent, command was less of a military hierarchy and more of a rotating group therapy session. Every decision took 5 arguments, 3 gods interfering, and at least one guy storming off in a huff. The daily schedule looked something like this. Morning, fight Trojans. Afternoon, complain about supplies. Evening, argue with each other. Night, get smited for something stupid. And speaking of stupid, supplies were a constant disaster. The Greeks, being excellent at war, but terrible at logistics, spent more time raiding nearby towns than planning actual meals. Greek soldiers often lived on whatever they could steal, which meant their war diet consisted of old bread, lukewarm goat, and the lingering taste of resentment. On the battlefield, things weren't much better. The war devolved into a series of individual duels, skirmishes, and the occasional mass brawl. These weren't organized battles as much as they were chaotic wrestling matches with sharper accessories. One day you'd see 2 champions squaring off in single combat. The next day half the camp was in a shouting match over whose cousin got stabbed by whom. Meanwhile, the Trojans stayed behind their god-fortified walls, occasionally launching sorties but mostly playing defense. Their strategy boiled down to don't die, also don't open the gates. It worked surprisingly well. Morale inside the city remained high enough to keep going, helped by the fact that they weren't living in tents full of sand and regrets. The Greek camp, on the other hand, was like an ancient reality show. Fights broke out daily, some with swords, some with words, and occasionally with plague. Yes, plague, courtesy of Apollo, who launched one from the sky after his favorite priest was disrespected. One minute you're trying to plan a siege, the next minute your general is coughing up a lung and blaming the gods, which, to be fair, was accurate. Despite the misery, moments of heroism and legend began to pile up. This was when reputations were forged, sometimes literally with fire and bronze. Ajax, the bigger one, became known for his brute strength, holding the line when others faltered. Diomedes went on a rampage so impressive, he even injured a couple of gods. And then there was Patroclus, Achilles' companion, who was quickly becoming the emotional support warrior everyone needed. But none of this really pushed the war forward. For years the conflict was stuck in a loop. Fight, stalemate, skirmish, die, repeat. Every now and then, a new prophecy would drop, like a hot gossip scroll, usually delivered by a seer who looked perpetually exhausted and smelled vaguely of smoke. These divine hints promised victory, if only the Greeks sacrificed the right animal, pleased the right god, or fetched some mystical artifact from a place no one wanted to go. And still, Troy stood. By year 5, Even the most battle-hardened warriors began to question the mission. Was this really worth it? Was Helen really that beautiful? And why did they not just build a giant ladder? But pride and oaths kept them going. Also, they'd been at it so long that giving up now felt more embarrassing than dying. So the war dragged on. The beach became a permanent camp. The tents turned into crude structures. Soldiers, aged, children back home grew up without fathers, and the gods occasionally dropped by to stir the pot just when things were starting to feel routine. What began as a dramatic quest for honor had become a bureaucratic nightmare of bronze boredom and body odor. But no one could turn back now, not when so much blood had already soaked the sand, and so they waited and fought and waited some more, because the one thing everyone had learned by now: Troy wasn't falling anytime soon. If the Trojan War was a chaotic group project, Achilles was the guy who showed up, aced every fight, and then rage quit because someone touched his stapler. You'd think a warrior, blessed by the gods, dipped in magic river water, and basically built like a murder machine would be unshakable. But no, turns out, all it took was a stolen girlfriend and some bruised pride to turn Achilles from unstoppable war god into the Greek camp's angriest shut-in. Let's rewind to the middle of the siege. Year who knows anymore. When things were still going nowhere, but at least going nowhere violently. The Greeks had sacked a nearby city because nothing lifts morale like looting, and divided up the spoils, which, this being Bronze Age logic, included women. Enter Briseis, a captured Trojan woman, given to Achilles as a war prize. Because yes, that was a thing, and yes, it was as morally awful as it sounds. Now here comes Agamemnon, king of kings, commander of the Greek forces, and walking ego with a helmet. He had also received a woman, Chryseis, as his prize. But when her priest dad, a VIP in Apollo's fan club, demanded her back, and Agamemnon said no, Apollo hit the Greeks with a plague so fast, it basically had express shipping, dead soldiers, sick horses, general panic. Eventually, Agamemnon gave Chryseis back to her dad to stop the divine pestilence. But like any powerful man with too much pride and not enough wisdom, he needed to prove he was still in charge. So he pulled the brilliant move of saying, "I'm taking Achilles' girl instead." Now imagine being Achilles. You've spent years stabbing Trojans, leading your own army, the Myrmidons, carrying this entire war effort on your oiled-up shoulders, and suddenly this guy waltzes in and steals your prize. It didn't matter that Achilles didn't love Briseis. What mattered was that someone disrespected him. So Achilles did what any emotionally volatile demigod would do. He quit the war, walked off the battlefield, and parked himself in his tent, like a brooding storm cloud with perfect abs, and he stayed there, refusing to fight, ignoring the bloodshed, pouting with godlike intensity, while his fellow Greeks got absolutely clobbered. The camp fell apart without him. Morale tanked. Trojans started pushing the Greeks back toward the sea. At one point, they nearly burned the ships, and all the while, Achilles sat in his tent, polishing his armor, composing angry speeches to himself, and occasionally staring into the middle distance, like a tragic Instagram poet. Achilles didn't just sulk. He turned sulking into performance art. Even when other leaders, like Odysseus, came to beg him to return, offering gifts, apologies, and promises of eternal glory, Achilles basically said, "Nah, die without me." It was a masterclass in holding a grudge. But then came the one thing that could actually move him, Patroclus. Now, let's talk about Patroclus. Depending on the version, he was Achilles' best friend, lover, cousin, or all of the above. What's certain is that he was the emotional duct tape holding Achilles together, the only one who could reach him when he was in full tantrum mode. So when Patroclus saw the Greeks getting decimated, he came up with a desperate plan. He would wear Achilles' armor, lead the Myrmidons, and pretend to be Achilles on the battlefield, just to scare the Trojans and rally the troops. It worked. For a while, Patroclus charged in, drove the Trojans back, and became the temporary golden hero. But the thing about pretending to be a demigod is that eventually, a real warrior will notice you're slightly more mortal than advertised. That warrior was Hector, Troy's greatest fighter, who mistook Patroclus for Achilles, and then killed him. And just like that, Achilles snapped. Grief didn't make him weep, it made him explode. All the bottled rage, wounded pride, and divine fury came pouring out, like a dam breaking in a thunderstorm. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for reinforcements. He just grabbed his armor, new, shiny, and God-forged by Hephaestus, and stormed back into battle like the final boss in a mythological video game. What followed wasn't a fight, it was a slaughter. Achilles tore through Trojan ranks like a man possessed. His presence alone sent soldiers fleeing. His spear found flesh like it had a grudge of its own. It wasn't just vengeance, it was unrestrained divine fury made flesh. And it didn't stop with Hector. Achilles dragged Hector's corpse around the city walls in full public view like a man who had skipped grief counseling and gone straight to vengeful war ghost. But even unstoppable warriors have soft spots, literally, because for all his strength, Achilles had one vulnerability, that infamous heel, the one part of his body his mother hadn't dunked in the river Styx. One tiny unprotected spot on an otherwise invincible man, not a flaw in combat, a flaw in fate. That weak heel wasn't just a body part, it was a metaphor for pride, for ego, for the one thing every warrior has that can bring them down. And as Achilles burned through his rage, destiny started loading its next arrow. But for now, the lesson was clear. Don't insult Achilles, don't steal his stuff, and definitely, don't kill his best friend, unless you're actively trying to get vaporized on a mythic scale. Achilles wasn't just the Greeks' strongest fighter, he was a one-man storm system. His weakness, his heel, his strength, everything but conflict resolution, in a war stuffed with divinely meddled man-children, ego-fueled tantrums, and enough bad decisions to fuel 10 Greek tragedies. Hector was the guy who actually had his life together, a husband, father, prince, and general. Hector was the backbone of Troy, trying to hold the city, the army, and his wildly chaotic extended family together with nothing but honor, duty, and sheer willpower. In a world where most characters were either cursed, bewitched, or actively asking to be turned into birds by angry gods, Hector just wanted to protect his people and go home for dinner. Unfortunately for him, Greek mythology doesn't reward stability, it feeds on drama. And Hector, for all his virtues, was standing in the way of a very angry Achilles with a new set of God-forged armor and revenge radiating from his pores. But let's not skip ahead to the end just yet. Hector's whole story is a slow burn tragedy, the kind where you know things are going to go terribly wrong, but you can't help but hope. Maybe, just maybe, the writers will show mercy this time. Spoiler, they won't. Hector wasn't just any Trojan warrior, he was the Trojan warrior, a man who didn't ask for this war, didn't start it, and probably wanted to punt Paris over the city walls once a day, just to release tension. His younger brother's charming little kidnapping stunt had triggered a war, and now it was Hector who had to fix everything while Paris walked around like a lovesick peacock. He wasn't flashy, he didn't have divine rage or magic armor, but what Hector did have was consistency, discipline, and the rare quality of not being the absolute worst. He showed up to battle not for fame, but because people were counting on him. He didn't fight to prove something, he fought because if he didn't, no one else would. And let's be real, he was good, really good. He held the line against the Greeks year after year. He dueled some of the best warriors Greece had to offer, and came out on top more than once. He even smashed through the Greek fortifications at one point, and nearly burned their ships. That's like scoring a touchdown in the fourth quarter of a 10-year game, without cheerleaders, snacks, or working sanitation. But even heroes need to recharge. And Hector had his softer side too. In one of the most tender moments in the entire Iliad, Hector returns to the city during a break in the fighting. There, he sees his wife Andromache and their baby Astyonax on the walls. She begs him not to return to battle. She knows he'll die. He knows it too. And what does Hector do? He lifts his helmet to kiss his son, tells his wife to live and protect the child, and walks back out to face fate anyway. Because that's who Hector was. The man who showed up, even when it meant running headlong into doom. And then came Achilles. Patroclus was dead. Achilles had returned to the battlefield with the energy of a grief-stricken typhoon. The Greeks, who had been spiraling into defeat, suddenly had their superweapon back, and the Trojans knew exactly what that meant. Panic set in, warriors fell, and Hector, always the last line of defense, stood before the gates of Troy, knowing full well that his number was up. But he didn't run. Well, technically he did for a bit. In what might be the most human moment in the whole war, Hector saw Achilles charging toward him, and did what any sane person would do. He turned and booked it, not out of cowardice, out of survival instinct. The two of them ended up playing the most tragic game of chase in literature, circling the walls of Troy 3 times like the world's deadliest track meet. The gods, naturally, were watching this like Olympic judges, and eventually one of them intervened to stop Hector and force the duel. And then, the inevitable. Achilles killed Hector. No tricks, no divine rescue, just a brutal one-on-one fight between the war's brightest flame and its noblest soul. Hector fought like the hero he always was, brave, resolute, and desperately trying to defend a doomed city. But it wasn't enough. Now, you'd think Achilles, having gotten his vengeance, would stop there. You'd think wrong. Achilles, still incandescent with rage, tied Hector's body to the back of his chariot and dragged it around the city walls. Yes, that happened. The most respected warrior in Troy, a man who died protecting his home, was reduced to a meat piñata in front of his entire family. It wasn't war, it was pure spite on wheels. And what's worse, Hector's father Priam had to sneak into Achilles' tent, beg for his son's body, and appeal to whatever sliver of humanity Achilles had left. And somehow, it worked. Achilles, after all the fury, finally saw the grief of another father and relented. But by then, Hector was gone. Troy had lost its shield, its leader, its moral compass. And if this were a fair story, Hector would have lived, grown old, and written a very stern memoir titled, "Please Stop Making Terrible Choices." But in Greek myth, good men die, bad men live, and the gods just watch, occasionally nudging the chaos along like it's their weekend hobby. So here lies Hector, hero, father, brother, prince, too good for this war, too noble for this world, and tragically, exactly the kind of man mythology loves to kill off for emotional impact. You know the saying, if something looks too good to be true, it probably contains 30 bloodthirsty Greeks hiding in its torso. At least, that should have been carved into the gates of Troy after the greatest scam in mythological history. Because let's be clear, the Trojan horse wasn't just a story, it was a masterclass in how not to do security. And it all started with one massive wooden red flag that everyone decided to ignore. By this point in the war, things were looking surprisingly hopeful for the Trojans. Achilles was dead, arrow to the heel. More on that next chapter. Greek morale had hit rock bottom, and the beaches, once littered with tents and ships, were suddenly empty. The Trojans blinked, rubbed their eyes, and realized their enemies were gone. Just gone. In their place, a giant wooden horse, sitting at the gates. No note, no context. Just a 40-foot-tall surprise sculpture facing the city like a very ominous art installation. And instead of going, "This feels like a trap," the Trojans stared at it and went, "Wow, they shouldn't have." This was, to put it mildly, the worst decision in the city's history. And remember, this is the same city that once let Paris pick his wife by breaking up a foreign marriage. But to understand how Troy got bamboozled so epically, you need to meet Sinon, the guy who pulled off the greatest acting performance in ancient warfare, a Greek soldier deliberately left behind to sell the lie. Sinon was discovered near the horse, looking disheveled, beaten, and just pitiful enough to pass as a tragic backstory on legs. He told the Trojans a sob story for the ages. The Greeks, he claimed, had turned on him. He'd escaped their cruelty. The horse, oh, that was totally just a gift to Athena, left behind to make up for offending her. The Greeks had built it too big to fit inside the walls, deliberately, because if the Trojans ever brought it into the city, it would bring Athena's wrath down upon them. And the Trojans, instead of asking follow-up questions like, "Why does it have air holes?" or "Is this the same Athena who's been smiting us for 10 years?" nodded solemnly and said, "We should definitely roll this thing inside, for the goddess." This, of course, was after Laocoon, a Trojan priest, screamed, "Don't trust it. I swear there are people inside," and flung a spear into the horse's side. And just when it seemed like common sense might actually win for once, sea serpents showed up out of nowhere, ate Laocoon and his sons, and the Trojans, in classic ancient logics fashion, went, "Welp, the gods must really want this horse in here." Yes, the gods sent serpents to silence the one guy making sense, and instead of saying, "Wow, maybe the gods are trying to warn us," the Trojans decided the priest got what was coming for slandering free furniture. So the horse was dragged into the city, rolled triumphantly through the gates, and parked right in the middle of town, like the world's most cursed centerpiece. That night, Troy partied like it was the end of the war, because they thought it was music, dancing, wine, victory speeches, and not a single person thinking, "Hey, where's Sinon?" Meanwhile, inside the horse, a squad of elite Greek soldiers, including Odysseus, who definitely high-fived someone when the gates closed behind them, sat in silence, crouched in what must have been the world's least ergonomic military operation. They waited, probably sore, sweaty, and quietly judging the acoustics of the victory party below. And once the Trojans were passed out in a collective wine coma, Sinon slipped away, crept to the gates, and let in the entire Greek army, which had been hiding just over the horizon in ships, waiting for the signal. The rest, of course, was butchery. The Greeks swarmed into the sleeping city like locusts with swords. Fires lit the night. Doors were broken, temples desecrated, and the proud city of Troy, 10 years unbroken, fell in a single evening because someone believed a stranger's story about a divine gift horse. And look, we've all been tempted by free stuff. Modern people fall for phishing scams. We click, "You've won." Banners. We give our passwords to people claiming to be tech support, but the Trojans, they invented the original click to claim your doom moment. Except in their case, the click was opening the city gates to a wooden death box. The irony is immortal. They lost not in battle, but by trusting an actor, believing a magical story, and failing to question a giant statue full of suspicious craftsmanship. It wasn't a military loss, it was a catastrophic lapse in common sense, dressed up as piety and optimism. The horse was less a gift, and more a Trojan inbox virus, and the whole city hit download without scanning it first. So let it be remembered, when your enemy leaves you a mysterious monument and flees without a word, maybe don't immediately put it next to your city's most sacred temple, because in the end, Troy didn't fall because it was outmatched. It fell because it trusted the world's most dramatic con man and a giant piece of pinewood performance art. There are bad days, and then there's the night Troy got deleted from the map like someone rage-quitting a game of Civilization. This wasn't a siege anymore. This was a cataclysm, an all-out annihilation of a city that had stood proud for 10 years under siege, only to collapse in one night, thanks to a horse, a lie, and a hangover. When the Greek soldiers burst out of the wooden horse, it was not with the quiet precision of elite commandos. No, it was with the raw, pent-up fury of men who had spent years fighting in the dirt, eating questionable goat stew, and arguing with gods. They hit the streets of Troy with swords drawn and zero chill. At the same time, the rest of the Greek army, previously hiding behind a convenient hill like a kid playing hide-and-seek, stormed through the now open gates. There were no trumpet blasts, no noble duels, no announcements. There was only fire, steel, and the sound of people realizing far too late that the party was over and the surprise guests were not friendly. The Trojans, drunk, unarmed, and blissfully unaware just hours before, woke up in a panic as flames licked the skies. What had been a victory celebration was now the most chaotic wake in human history. Families fled through smoke-filled streets. Soldiers scrambled to organize a defense while wearing yesterday's toga. Temples burned. Palaces collapsed. Priests screamed at the heavens. The heavens, presumably, looked down and said, "Yeah, that's on you." Let's talk about King Priam, the aged ruler of Troy, whose night went from victory banquet to final moments in a temple full of corpses. As the Greeks tore through the city, Priam fled to an altar for protection, a sacred place that, in theory, should have made him off limits. But this was the finale, and the rules were out the window. In burst Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, and apparent winner of most unhinged Greek. Fueled by the legacy of his dad, and absolutely zero remorse, he slaughtered Priam right there at the altar. The king, once a symbol of dignity and leadership, met his end as an old man butchered in his temple. And yes, his last thought probably was, "I really should have said no to that horse." It didn't stop there. Greek warriors ran through the city like mythological arsonists with a to-do list. Burn everything, eliminate anything that moves, loot gold, treasure, and maybe a few tragic backstories. Hecuba, Priam's wife, was dragged off as a prisoner. Andromache, Hector's widow, was taken too. Her baby Astyanax was not so lucky. The Greeks, worried that Hector's son would grow up and come back for revenge, because clearly They'd been reading too much of their own prophecy scrolls. Threw the child from the city walls. That's right. They killed a baby out of strategic paranoia. It was that kind of night. And what about Cassandra, the cursed prophetess of Troy? She had been yelling, "Don't trust that horse," for hours before the disaster. But of course, no one ever believed Cassandra. It was her whole thing. So naturally, she survived long enough to be dragged out of the temple of Athena by Ajax the Lesser, who really wasn't living up to the whole Greek hero brand. The goddess Athena, seeing her temple desecrated, was not amused. She'd wait a bit, but she'd get her revenge on that guy. Spoiler alert, his ship sinks later, dramatically. Meanwhile, the city's buildings collapsed around the chaos. The fires were everywhere, roofs caving in, statues melting, shrines reduced to rubble. The once beautiful citadel of Troy, home to centuries of culture, was now a flaming pile of bad decisions and scorched marble. If cities had facial expressions, Troy's would have been, "I made a huge mistake." Some Trojans fought bravely to the end. Others begged the gods. Some tried to flee through secret tunnels, while others climbed to rooftops, hoping against hope for mercy that would never come. And above it all, the Greek generals watched from their vantage points. Swords drawn, faces lit by the flames of a decade-long grudge finally fulfilled. Because that's what this was. Vengeance served hot, flaming, and overcooked. The Greeks weren't just conquering Troy, they were erasing it. This was about pride, oaths, honor, and the fact that thousands of their friends had died while waiting outside this city for 10 years, watching walls that refused to fall. Now finally, everything was crashing down, and they wanted everyone to know it. They destroyed art, history, temples, things they themselves had once revered. They killed nobles, civilians, even animals, in what can only be described as a Bronze Age apocalypse party, with no survivors on the guest list. It wasn't enough to win. They had to make sure Troy never rose again, and they succeeded by sunrise. Troy was no longer a city. It was a myth in progress, a pile of ash, destined to become a cautionary tale for poets, playwrights, and suspicious homeowners. The Trojan horse wasn't just a trick, it was the key that opened the gates to complete and unrelenting ruin. Troy didn't fall in battle. It was ambushed in its sleep, drowned in fire, and buried beneath a mountain of hubris. You'd think, after 10 years of bloody siege warfare and one fiery night of total destruction, the Greeks would have sailed home, hugged their families, written some epic poems, and lived happily ever after. They didn't. Instead, what followed was a long, winding, sea-soaked collection of curses, detours, drownings, divine punishments, and one very tired hero who forgot how maps work. Because the Trojan War didn't really end, it just transitioned into a franchise of mythological sequels, each more tragic and exhausting than the last. Let's start with Odysseus, the man with a brain sharp enough to invent the Trojan horse, but apparently not sharp enough to read a compass. After Troy burned to the ground and the smoke cleared, Odysseus packed up his crew and headed home to Ithaca. Should have taken 2 weeks max. Instead, he spent the next 10 years zigzagging across the Mediterranean, like someone asking for directions from every cursed island on the map. Along the way, he got shipwrecked, cursed by Poseidon, seduced by sorceresses, trapped in caves with man-eating giants, and even turned some of his men into pigs. Literally, and the whole time, he was just trying to get home to Penelope, his long-suffering wife, who had to fend off dozens of obnoxious suitors, run the kingdom, raise their son, and not go completely insane, wondering if her husband had fallen off the edge of the world, or worse, shacked up with yet another goddess. To be fair, Odysseus did have a bit of divine interference working against him. After all, he'd royally ticked off Poseidon by blinding his Cyclops son, Polyphemus. And if there's one thing you should never do, it's poke a sea god's kid in the eye, and then brag about it. Poseidon responded by turning the ocean into a never-ending escape room with no exit. Odysseus's journey home, immortalized in the Odyssey, is equal parts heroic saga and celestial road rage. He made it eventually, but only after losing all his men, nearly losing his sanity, and learning that maybe boasting is not always the best policy. And while Odysseus was playing Mediterranean Misery Tour, 1190 BCE, another Trojan survivor was quietly building his own legend, Aeneas. Unlike Paris, Aeneas actually wasn't an idiot. When Troy started burning, He didn't stay and fight to the bitter end. Instead, he grabbed his elderly father Anchises, his young son Ascanius, and a pocketful of emotional damage, and fled the city. Carrying his dad on his back, sword in hand and fire behind him, Aeneas became the poster child for "I didn't start this war, but I'm definitely going to finish something." What did he finish? Oh, just the founding myth of Rome. According to Roman propaganda, legend, Aeneas wandered for years, much like Odysseus, before landing in Italy. There, his descendants would eventually become the founders of Rome, because what better way to start a new civilization than by escaping one burning city and building a future superpower on top of the trauma? In other words, Troy falls, Rome rises. That's like losing your house and immediately deciding to build a skyscraper in its place, with marble, ambition, and a suspicious amount of wolf-based child-rearing. Meanwhile, the other Greek heroes didn't exactly fare much better than Odysseus. Many of them were killed on the way home, some murdered by their wives. Shout out to Agamemnon, who walked into a bathtub and didn't walk out, and others just kind of vanished into mythology's version of the HR complaint file. Mysteriously, permanently off the radar. Why? Because apparently, burning a sacred city, desecrating temples, and angering every major deity has consequences. Who knew? Athena, once Team Greek, turned on them for Ajax the Lesser's sins. Poseidon didn't forgive, ever. And even Zeus, king of gods and champion of drama, seemed more interested in making examples than handing out medals. And what of the Trojans? Most were dead, enslaved, or scattered. The survivors were left to pick up the pieces, or in Aeneas's case, plant entirely new ones elsewhere. The noble Hector was gone. Priam's dynasty was ash. Cassandra was taken, her prophecies ignored even in captivity. The glory of war had become a legacy of ruin. In the end, the Trojan War wasn't a victory. It was a Pyrrhic tale of what happens when pride, lust, and divine egos get together for 10 uninterrupted years. Everyone learned a lesson, or claimed they did. But in true mythological fashion, those lessons were soon ignored in the next war, the next curse, or the next poor soul who offended a deity by breathing wrong. The heroes came home to broken kingdoms. The victors limped back, empty-handed. The gods retreated to Olympus to toast the chaos, like it was prime-time entertainment. And the mortals, they rebuilt, they buried, they told stories. Because when the gods move on, and the fires burn out, all you can do is remember, and try not to fall for the next giant wooden horse that shows up at your door. Before he became Rome's biggest walking red flag, Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, you can already tell he was overcompensating, was born into what looked like a dream resume for most likely to succeed as emperor. Born in 12 CE into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Caligula had one foot in power and the other in a pair of miniature military sandals. Yes, literal baby boots, more on that in a second. His father was Germanicus, a Roman general so beloved that people genuinely cried when he entered cities. He was the kind of guy Rome loved. Handsome, brave, probably smelled better than most legionaries, and actually seemed like he cared about not burning the empire to the ground. In contrast, Caligula would later make burning the empire look like a weekend hobby. But back then, little Gaius had big dad energy behind him. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, ambitious, sharp-tongued, and fiercely loyal to her late husband's legacy. She was the kind of woman who didn't just lean into Roman politics. She elbowed her way through the marble halls. Unfortunately for Caligula, growing up around cutthroat dynastic tension and whispered murder plots was less warm family memories and more future therapy session waiting to happen. Now, here's where the nickname kicks in. As a child, Gaius was taken on military campaigns with his father across Germania. Picture it, a toddler strutting around camp in a custom-made legionary uniform, complete with tiny armor and hobnailed sandals. The soldiers adored him and jokingly called him Caligula, meaning little boots. Cute, right? Well, he hated it, absolutely despised it. You know that kid in school who gets called Peanut once and swears eternal vengeance? That was Caligula. Later, when he became emperor, mentioning little boots in his presence was the fast track to sudden unemployment, or sudden death. But during those early years, he played the adorable mascot role so well that no one suspected this pint-sized patriot would grow up to declare war on the ocean. The family image began to unravel in true Roman fashion. Public betrayal, backstabbing, and conveniently timed deaths. Germanicus died under mysterious circumstances in Syria when Caligula was just 6. Some said it was poison. Others said it was Tiberius, the reigning emperor, and all-around damp dish rag of a ruler who had him eliminated. Either way, Rome wept. Agrippina blamed everyone, and little Caligula learned early on that trust was for suckers. From there, things got darker than a toga after a Senate stabbing. Tiberius grew increasingly paranoid, as all emperors eventually did, and began executing anyone who looked at him sideways, including several members of Caligula's family. Agrippina was eventually exiled and starved to death. 2 of Caligula's brothers were imprisoned and died mysteriously, and by age 17, young Gaius had lost most of his family and gained a PhD in political paranoia. So what do you do when your family is publicly erased and you're stuck under the watch of a dictator who may have murdered your father? If you're Caligula, you smile politely, say yes, Uncle Tiberius, and become the most disturbingly agreeable houseguest on the Isle of Capri. For 6 years, Caligula lived with the aging emperor in exile, watching as Tiberius sank into paranoia, surrounded by astrologers, yes-men, and a rotating cast of what ancient sources politely called youthful companions. Translation: it was less a government retreat, more an NSFW retirement villa. Here's the thing. Everyone knew Caligula was next in line. He was the last male of the bloodline that traced back to Augustus himself. And so, when Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, allegedly smothered by Caligula's bodyguard or pillow-assisted natural causes, ancient history is fuzzy like that. Rome practically burst into applause. The golden boy, the child of heroic Germanicus, the survivor of palace intrigue. Surely, this was the return of Roman greatness. Spoiler, it was not. The Senate celebrated. The people cheered. Temples offered sacrifices. Everyone toasted to the idea that the horrors of Tiberius were over and that Caligula, forged in fire, would rule with justice, wisdom, and mercy. What they got, instead, was a man who took absolute power, stared at it for a moment, and then set it on fire while laughing. They thought they were getting Augustus 2.0. What they actually got was what if Willy Wonka had a god complex and an executioner. So here ends the origin story of Caligula, the child mascot who wore little boots and learned all the wrong lessons from every adult around him. The stage was set, the toga was pressed, and the descent into imperial madness was about to begin. For a moment, just a moment, Rome was in love when Caligula became emperor in 37 CE. It was like the empire collectively let out a sigh of relief. After years of Tiberius brooding on Capri, like an evil landlord with a death list, the arrival of Caligula felt like a miracle. The people didn't just like him, they worshipped him. Statues were raised, crowds chanted. Senators awkwardly pretended they'd always supported him. He could have walked down the street, punched a pigeon, and people would have called it a divine sign. And to be fair, at first, he earned it. Caligula's early days on the throne were straight out of the How to Win the Crowd playbook. He freed political prisoners, recalled exiles, and even paid out generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, ensuring the guys with swords were, emotionally invested in his success. He staged lavish public games, not just a few gladiators and some stale bread. No, chariot races, beast hunts, naval battles staged in artificial lakes, and more food than anyone could realistically digest. It was like the Super Bowl, Coachella, and a buffet line at Caesar's palace had a baby, and it was all on the emperor's tab. Technically Rome's treasury, but let's not get bogged down in fiscal ethics. He didn't stop there. He burned tax records in front of the crowd, symbolically wiping out debts. Can you imagine? You wake up, go to the forum, and watch your back taxes go up in smoke like a Roman stimulus package. The people went wild. The Senate blinked nervously, and Caligula himself, charismatic, charming, smiling like he hadn't grown up surrounded by treason and slow poisonings. For the first few months, he played the role of the benevolent golden boy flawlessly. He spoke to the people directly. He honored his father Germanicus with grand ceremonies. He even promised to restore the Republic, classic move when you have no intention of doing so. But here's the thing. Beneath that radiant toga was a man who had studied the art of flattery, vengeance, and emotional theatre like it was a second religion. He knew what the people wanted to see, and for a little while he gave it to them with confetti and lions. He also knew what the Senate wanted to hear. He buttered them up with speeches about shared power and tradition, while also carefully reminding them that he controlled the military, the money, and the moral high ground, at least temporarily. Even the provinces adored him. Messages of goodwill poured in. Shrines popped up. He was praised as the new Augustus. One poor poet even tried to sneak Caligula into a hymn alongside Jupiter. Nobody knows what happened to him, but let's assume it involved a suspicious absence. There were even public celebrations of Caligula's recovery from a minor illness early in his reign. The entire city went into festival mode when he got better, because back then losing a good emperor felt like hearing your favorite band broke up and your aqueduct collapsed on the same day. But there were signs, subtle ones, little flashes of the storm to come. One time, Caligula stood in front of a crowd and openly wept, not for the gods or Rome or the glory of the Republic, but because, in his words, he realized he was mortal and would die someday. And everyone kind of just clapped, because when your emperor starts crying about his own death in the middle of a victory speech, you clap or risk becoming next week's sacrifice to Mercury. He began dressing more flamboyantly. Silken robes, golden sandals, even divine cosplay. Yes, he started dressing like various gods just for fun. It was still early days, and people chalked it up to youthful flair, or maybe they were afraid to say anything louder than a whisper. Rome loved its gossip, but it loved keeping its head even more. But the moment that truly foreshadowed the turning tide, when Caligula began erecting statues of himself in temples, not in the back corner, front and center, the kind of thing that says, "Hey Jupiter, scoot over, I've got miracles too." Still, nobody dared question it yet, because Rome hadn't had this much public optimism since someone invented wine and realized grapes weren't just for decoration. This was Caligula's honeymoon phase, a carefully choreographed performance where everything was golden, bread flowed freely, the games dazzled, and the emperor smiled like a man who hadn't yet invented psychological warfare as a leadership style. But as every Roman knew too well, honeymoons end, and when they do, there's usually poison, betrayal, and someone falling off a balcony. For now though, Rome slept soundly under a sky lit by fireworks and illusion, blissfully unaware that the man running the empire was not a savior. He was a golden retriever with rabies, and he was about to bite. It started with a fever. That's how the horror stories always begin. In the autumn of 37 CE, just months after Rome threw a parade for its new emperor, Caligula fell gravely ill. No one knows exactly what it was: malaria, epilepsy, encephalitis, demonic possession. But whatever it was, it dragged him to death's doorstep, and then said, "Actually, you know what? Let's make this interesting." For days, the empire held its breath. Priests sacrificed animals. Senators who had previously been plotting just in case started publicly weeping. People fasted, prayed, and performed every ritual short of sacrificing their neighbor to keep the golden emperor alive. And when Caligula recovered, Rome celebrated, and then instantly regretted it, because the man who woke up was not the same man who fell asleep. Gone was the generous, smiling emperor who handed out tax breaks and pardons like party favors. In his place stood something colder, sharper, paranoid, unhinged, and deeply committed to using the imperial office as a stage for psychological horror. It's as if the fever didn't just burn his body, it burned the last circuits of restraint from his mind. His behavior changed dramatically, and most importantly, visibly. The first sign: his eyes. Ancient sources describe them as suddenly haunted, wild, and unnerving. Suetonius claims he began staring at people silently for uncomfortably long periods, just long enough to make senators wonder if they were about to be promoted or beheaded. Soon, he became convinced that everyone was out to kill him. And to be fair, in ancient Rome, that was a pretty solid bet. But where other emperors might have tightened security or whispered to their advisors, Caligula started preemptively eliminating anyone who gave him funny vibes. Family, suspicious, friends, disposable, senators, walking liabilities. He executed or exiled dozens of people, often without explanation, sometimes without trial, and occasionally without remembering their names. Entire households vanished overnight. If someone coughed during a speech, Caligula would reportedly pause, point, and have them removed. Or worse, used as entertainment in the next day's arena spectacle. And it wasn't just paranoia, it was flair. Caligula didn't just punish people, he theatrically annihilated them. He once invited a nobleman to dinner, chatted pleasantly, poured wine, and then casually ordered his guards to drag the man out mid-meal and execute him. No warning, no reason. Just, hey, this stew's good. Also, off with his head. And then he finished the meal. This was the new Caligula, an emperor who saw governance as performance art, with a body count. To drive the point home, he began issuing contradictory orders on purpose. You weren't just supposed to follow him, you were supposed to guess what he wanted, before he wanted it, and hope he didn't change his mind halfway through. It was like working for a very murderous game show host, and if paranoia was his new favorite wine, godhood was the garnish. After the illness, Caligula's belief in his own divinity kicked into overdrive. He stopped referring to himself as emperor and started identifying as a literal god. Not like a god, not inspired by a god, an actual walking, talking, toga-draped deity. He had golden statues of himself placed in temples across the empire, sometimes demanding that worshippers treat his image like Jupiter himself. In Alexandria, he tried to have his likeness installed in the Jewish temple, a move so tone-deaf it almost triggered a regional rebellion. When asked why he believed he was divine, he allegedly replied, "I have the power to kill whomever I want, whenever I want. What else is godhood?" A compelling argument. Sure, terrifying too. Meanwhile, the Senate was in full panic mode. These weren't just eccentric quirks, they were signs that the man with control over the army, the treasury, and the courts of life and death had slipped the leash of reality. But could they do anything? Of course not. Speaking up meant your name became a fun footnote on a tombstone by next week. Even his close aides, those who had risen with him, celebrated his victories, were left scrambling to stay on his good side. One advisor supposedly pretended to laugh at every joke, nod at every nonsensical decree, and clap with such enthusiasm that he dislocated his own shoulder. Survival required creativity, and while the city trembled, Caligula was reportedly sleeping only an hour or two a night, pacing through the halls, mumbling to himself, or on a good night, whispering threats to statues. So what exactly happened during that illness? Scholars argue. Some say it triggered a neurological breakdown. Others blame epilepsy, PTSD, brain inflammation, or long repressed trauma, finally cracking through. Maybe it was all of the above, but the truth is, ancient Rome didn't need a diagnosis. It needed a time machine and a resignation letter. Because most people recover from illness. Caligula recovered into a Bond villain. He'd entered his reign with a golden laurel and a public smile. Now, he held the laurel like a knife, smiled like a shark, and ruled like the gods owed him sacrifices. By now, Caligula wasn't just acting like he ruled the world, he was fully convinced he was something beyond human, a walking thunderbolt in sandals, a living god among mortals, and occasionally a close personal friend of the moon. Yes, the moon, but we'll get there. Let's talk first about the divinity complex that took Caligula from eccentric ruler to spiritual identity crisis on steroids. Ancient Roman emperors were no strangers to deification after death. It was a neat little tradition where the Senate would nod solemnly and go, "Sure, that guy's a god now," after the emperor had stopped breathing. But Caligula, he didn't wait for death. He skipped the paperwork entirely and declared himself a living deity. No waiting period required. And not just one god. Oh no, that would be boring. Caligula rotated between different divine personas like they were outfits. Some days he was Jupiter, lord of lightning and authority. Other days he was Apollo, god of music, and the sun, although Caligula's musical ability was mostly limited to threatening to kill people who sang off-key. He also flirted with being Bacchus, the god of wine and party-fueled regrets. One particularly unhinged week, he allegedly demanded that people worship him as a reincarnated Venus, which, for a man with a history of executions and no eyebrows for conjuring, was a bold choice. Temples were rededicated to him. Statues of gods were retrofitted with his face. He built a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baia, just so he could ride across it wearing golden armor, while people screamed about his glory. Picture a flex, so unnecessary, it broke the economy. And then there were the private moon chats. According to ancient historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, both of whom wrote with a perfect mix of horror and barely disguised snark, Caligula would wander his palace at night and have full-on conversations with Luna, the moon goddess. Not symbolic, not poetic, literal moon monologues. Sometimes he'd yell at her. Sometimes he flirted. One source claims he even threatened her for spying on him too much. Now this raises several questions. Was this genuine belief or theatrical madness? Did the moon ever respond? And how many senators were paid to nod solemnly while pretending this was normal? But nothing, not divine cosplay, not celestial arguments, beats the story of Incitatus, Caligula's horse. And not just a pet horse, not just a fast horse. This was Rome's most spoiled, politically overqualified horse. Incitatus lived in a marble stable. His feed was mixed with gold flakes. He drank out of goblets better than anything the Senate got. He had guards, servants, a literal ivory manger, which means Caligula's horse lived like royalty and pooped like a deity. And then came the promotion. Caligula allegedly made Incitatus a priest, which is absurd, but technically still better than some of the real priests Rome had at the time. But wait, it gets better. He then threatened to make the horse a consul, one of the two highest political offices in the Roman Republic turned empire. That's right, he planned to make his horse a senator. Why? Because, as Caligula reportedly said, he doesn't interrupt me. Which, to be fair, makes Incitatus more respectful than most Roman politicians. Also, the horse never voted against him, never plotted behind his back, and didn't try to poison his soup. You can imagine the Senate sitting there, trying to decide which was worse, a lunatic emperor or a neighing political rival with better grooming habits. Some modern historians think the Incitatus stunt was Caligula's version of political trolling, a way of saying, I think so little of you people, my horse could do your jobs. And honestly, he wasn't entirely wrong. The Senate at this point was about as useful as a wax sword. Still, the implications were clear. The emperor wasn't pretending anymore. He believed his own divine PR. He believed he could talk to the stars, make animals sacred, and that the Roman people would go along with it. Or else, the empire was no longer ruled by law, tradition, or even fear. It was ruled by one man's bizarre imagination and the brutal muscle to back it up. Rome had become a theatre, and Caligula was the playwright, lead actor, and unhinged director, yelling at the moon. And in this drama, logic was optional, loyalty was mandatory, and the next Senate vote might involve hoofprints. When Caligula said, make yourself at home, what he really meant was, prepare to witness a bacchanalian fever dream, run by a lunatic with a flair for lighting, and a deep mistrust of clothed people. Once upon a time, the imperial palace was a dignified symbol of Roman power, columns, law, maybe the occasional tasteful mosaic. Under Caligula, it became a 24/7 luxury madhouse, where the only thing more abundant than silk was screaming. The moment Caligula realized that he, in his own words, could do whatever he wanted, the palace became less an administrative center and more a theme park for dangerous impulse control issues. And the theme? Absolute chaos with an open wine bar and optional murder. Let's start with the decor. The palace was transformed into a swirling display of gold-plated decadence. Walls were crusted in jewels. Statues of gods were reshaped to resemble Caligula himself. Because why settle for worship when you can redesign Olympus with your own jawline? Floors were inlaid with precious stones. Ceilings had trapdoors for surprise performances or surprise executions. And certain rooms reportedly changed function hourly. 1 hour a banquet, the next an execution stage, the next an orgy. And yes, the orgies were real. Caligula didn't just throw parties, he orchestrated hedonistic epics that made Dionysus look like a shy dinner guest. Senators, nobles, slaves, everyone could be summoned, stripped, and thrown into the emperor's very selective version of a social mixer. Guests weren't always sure if they were attending a party, a political ambush, or a bloodletting. Often it was all three. One guest described his experience as waking up hungover and alive. So a success. The food? Lavish, and occasionally poisoned, just to keep things interesting. Golden loaves, pearl-dissolved wine, flamingo tongues, dormice stuffed with honey, basically the Roman version of Too Rich to Chew. Sometimes Caligula would eat in complete silence while everyone else waited, not allowed to so much as sip their wine until he cracked a smile. Other times he would laugh maniacally mid-course, and order the chef be thrown into the Tiber, just to test if anyone had the nerve to protest. Spoiler, they didn't. But Caligula's favourite party trick, public executions during dinner. This wasn't back-alley justice. This was open-air death as entertainment, with front-row seating and a live reaction cam. It didn't even require a reason. One senator was reportedly executed for coughing too loud during a toast. Another was brought in and killed because Caligula didn't like the way he blinked. At one especially infamous banquet, he allegedly invited a group of guests and, halfway through the meal, pointed to a few and announced they'd be dead by morning, and then he kept eating. That's not just psychological warfare, that's fine dining with a side of dread. He once married a woman, divorced her the next day, and then invited her ex-husband to dinner as a jester. His humour was cruel, his jokes were sharp, and his power over people's fates was wielded like a child with a flamethrower, amused, unstable, and completely disinterested in collateral damage. And the performers? Let's just say Cirque du Soleil would have filed a complaint. Acrobats, actors, fire-breathers, nude dancers, animal trainers. Caligula paid top coin for shock value. One record suggests he forced senators to dress as gladiators and wrestle for entertainment. Another claims he hosted a dress as your worst enemy party and then beat the best costume to death. Musicians were expected to play non-stop. Bad notes? That was a lash. Wrong tempo? That was exile. Didn't know how to play? That was death, unless, of course, you blamed the instrument. Caligula was weirdly understanding about faulty instruments. String snapping? You live. Bad attitude? You die. Even the palace guards weren't safe. They were required to participate in elaborate role-playing routines to amuse the emperor. One day, pretending to be invaders, the next pretending to be statues. One poor soul stood motionless for 14 hours, dressed as Mars, before fainting and being tossed into the fountain for breaking character. And if all of this seems over the top, remember, this was just Tuesday. Caligula's palace wasn't just decadent, it was weaponized excess. He used luxury the way a mad king uses a loaded crossbow. Not because it's practical, but because it makes people uncomfortable and proves he can. Guests never knew whether they were entering a night of indulgence or a trapdoor into an unmarked grave. Every invitation felt like a dare. Every toast felt like a test. You were there to praise, to flatter, and above all, to survive the evening. It wasn't a home. It was part circus, part death metal concert, and part therapy session with absolutely no therapist in sight. And at the center of it all sat Caligula, laughing, watching, commanding, indulging, Rome's most dangerous party planner, and possibly the first man to combine interior design with psychological torture. So how do you top turning your palace into a homicidal nightclub and appointing your horse as a priest? Easy. You declare war on the ocean. In 39 CE, Caligula decided he wanted to do something dramatic, again. But this time, it wasn't about temples, parties, or randomly selecting dinner guests for execution. No, this was going to be a military campaign. The Roman legions, battle-hardened, disciplined, and ready for conquest, were summoned to the northern edge of Gaul. Why? Because the emperor was planning a massive invasion of Britain. Or so they thought. Britain, at this point in history, was like the empire's final boss, remote, foggy, and full of tribes who didn't particularly want Roman roads, taxes, or toga shops. Previous emperors had considered invading but never pulled the trigger. Caligula, ever the visionary or ever the lunatic, depending on your proximity to his bad side, announced he would succeed where others had failed. He mobilized thousands of troops. Warships were prepared. Siege weapons were dragged across rough terrain. Legions marched with grim determination. Morale was high. And then they arrived at the coast. And that's where things got weird. Instead of loading up the ships and launching an actual invasion, Caligula lined up his soldiers facing the English Channel, a salty expanse of waves and sea spray, and gave them the grandest order of his reign. Attack the sea. Not prepare to sail. Not ready arms. Not we strike at dawn. Attack the sea. And so, in one of the strangest chapters of military history, Roman legionaries were ordered to stab the ocean. They slashed at waves with swords, thrust spears into the tide. Some sources claim ballistae were aimed at the water, as if Poseidon himself was going to rise up and shout truce. There were even reports of catapults flinging rocks into the surf. just to show dominance. After the battle was over, spoiler, the sea took 0 casualties. Caligula strutted along the beach like Caesar returning from Gaul. He congratulated his troops on a great victory over Neptune, god of the sea. Some historians have generously called this symbolic, suggesting Caligula was trying to show Rome's supremacy over nature itself. But let's be honest, he was just mad at the ocean. Maybe it splashed him the wrong way. Maybe the tide was too sassy. Or maybe he just really wanted an excuse to scream at something he couldn't behead. And then came the souvenirs. In what has become one of the most surreal moments in Roman military lore, Caligula ordered his men to collect seashells. Not loot, not enemy armor, seashells. He called them spoils of the conquered ocean. Imagine thousands of armored Roman soldiers, veterans of actual wars, marching along the beach, solemnly picking up shells like schoolchildren on a field trip, led by Poseidon's least supervised cousin. The legions filled baskets. Officers documented the haul. It was a full military operation to gather beach decorations. Back in Rome, he declared a triumph, a full-on, glorious public celebration. Crowds gathered, musicians played, senators lined the streets. And what were they cheering for? A war against salt water. Caligula paraded through the city, waving and smiling like he'd just conquered Carthage again. Behind him followed carts full of seashells, presented to the people as if they were golden treasures from some distant barbarian horde. Behold, he may as well have shouted, the spoils of Neptune's domain. Tremble, clams, nobody dared laugh, at least, not out loud. Because by now Rome understood the rules. If Caligula says we're at war with waves, then we fight the tide. If he wants to knight a jellyfish, you applaud and offer it a Senate seat. And while modern historians scratch their heads trying to find logic, was it satire, divine theatre, an experimental leadership exercise gone rogue? The only thing we can say with certainty is this. Caligula didn't invade Britain. He invaded Beach Day, and not with a towel and sandals, but with swords, siege engines, and a grudge against sea foam. In the end, no British soil was touched. No enemy fortresses fell. But Caligula got what he wanted. A spectacle. A headline. Proof that not even Neptune was safe from his divine ego trip. And Rome, as always, was left dazed, confused, and very, very nervous. Because when your emperor starts collecting seashells as war trophies, it's not a question of if the madness will escalate. It's a question of how many people he'll make clap while he does it. By the time Caligula was done slapping the sea and parading seashells through Rome like trophies from a divine surf competition, the city had stopped asking what next and started whispering, how much worse can it get? The answer, as it turns out, was much, much worse. Because now we enter the part of the reign where Caligula stopped pretending to be amusing and leaned full tilt into the part of unfiltered, unhinged autocrat with zero chill and no moral speed bumps. This was not the phase where he humiliated senators. That was earlier. This was the phase where he hunted them for sport. Rome had become a glittering, blood-slick theatre, and its star performer had decided that fear, not law, not tradition, not reason, was going to be the new ruling principle. Caligula didn't just use fear to control people. He crafted it, perfected it, seasoned it with unpredictability, and served it cold. Every day in Rome became a new episode of Who's Getting Executed Now. Senators, once the empire's most powerful men, were reduced to jittery background dancers in Caligula's one-man horror opera. If they stood too tall, he accused them of treason. If they bowed too low, he called them insincere. Some were executed for plotting, others for being too rich, and one for the capital offense of having better hair. Yes, better hair. You see, Caligula began to feel threatened by handsomeness. If you were a good-looking man in Rome during this time, your best survival strategy was to frown, scowl, shave your head, and never make eye contact. Even then, the safest place was still far away from Caligula, and if you were lucky enough not to be executed, congratulations. You might be chosen for one of Caligula's favorite humiliations, running alongside his chariot. Picture this. A full-grown senator, draped in fine robes and public dignity, panting like a winded greyhound as Caligula drove his golden chariot at full speed through the streets, screaming with laughter, while demanding, "Faster, Senator, you call that imperial fitness?" And you couldn't stop. Stopping meant suspicion. Suspicion meant chains. Chains meant you were about to become part of dinner entertainment. Caligula's sense of fun had fully evolved into a performance art of cruelty. He would summon nobles for a banquet, greet them kindly, then casually announce one of their relatives had been executed, mid-meal, over oysters. Then he'd smile and say, "Don't let it ruin your appetite." That's not just tyranny. That's Michelin star psychological warfare, torture. Once a tool of interrogation became Caligula's go-to icebreaker. Sometimes he did it for information. More often, he did it for ambiance. One favorite pastime was ordering people slowly dismembered in front of dinner guests, occasionally throwing in fun commentary like, "Watch the eyes, they pop out if you twist just right." Rome became a city where laughter could mean survival. Laugh at his jokes, and you lived another day. Look confused? Hope you enjoyed your last sunrise. Caligula would test his court like a bored god, inventing absurd laws on the spot, and then punishing people for not obeying them retroactively. One week he banned anyone from mentioning goats. The next, he threw someone in prison for not complimenting his dance moves. A dancer himself, Caligula was reportedly fond of performing solo routines in the palace, and then demanding critiques from senators. The only correct answer was majestic, ethereal. "You are Rome, my lord." But the madness had a divine cherry on top. Caligula wasn't just cruel, he was cosmically cruel. He fully believed himself to be a living god, and gods, in his view, owed the world no explanations. He would walk into temples and chat with statues, mocking Jupiter for being lazy, and once ordered a statue of Zeus decapitated and replaced with his own head. And just in case anyone doubted his divinity, he began referring to himself as a living deity in official documents. He was no longer princeps or emperor, he was now your lord and god Caligula. Subtlety was not on the menu. Of course, the more erratic he became, the more the powerful Roman families clenched their teeth and plotted quietly. But plotting was dangerous, because Caligula's network of informants ran deep, and his paranoia had long since grown legs, wings, and a dagger. One noble was executed for buying a new toga. Why? Caligula thought it looked too triumphant. Another was beheaded for a dream someone claimed he had about being emperor. Rome wasn't just afraid, Rome was holding its breath, because every citizen, every senator, every soldier now understood the game. You weren't living under an emperor, you were living next to a volcano wearing a crown, and the only rule was, don't be the next eruption. Empathy, mercy, decency. In Caligula's Rome, those were punchlines. He ruled with the joy of a cat playing with its prey, and when he smiled, people flinched. Because when Caligula liked you, you got gifts. When he didn't, you got used as a party prop. By 41 CE, Rome wasn't so much functioning as it was flinching. Every sunrise under Caligula felt like spinning the wheel of death. Will it be a tax today? A stabbing? A law about goat-free dining? Senators were wearing out the soles of their sandals, pacing nervously, while the Praetorian Guard, Caligula's supposed protectors, were quietly asking the big question, so, how do we not die under this guy? The answer, eventually, was knives. Because while Caligula fancied himself a god, the people around him had grown tired of playing supporting roles in his divine improv comedy of horrors. His reign had devolved from eccentric tyranny into horror show with a laugh track made of screams. He had humiliated the Senate, executed nobles like it was part of his cardio routine, and left Rome feeling like a hostage in a golden panic room. And so, in the back halls of power, in whispers and scribbled notes, a plan was born. The people who were supposed to protect the emperor, his own Praetorian Guard, began to mutter the forbidden phrase, "What if we didn't?" Enter Cassius Chaerea, a tribune in the guard and frequent target of Caligula's schoolyard-level cruelty. The emperor mocked Chaerea relentlessly, calling him names that roughly translate to Miss Fancy Pants and Lady Voice, because nothing says secure leadership like bullying your own bodyguards. Eventually, Chaerea decided that the only way to restore Rome's dignity, and his own, was with cold, sharp vengeance. The plan was simple: wait for the right moment, strike hard, and hope the gods were tired of watching this reality show too. That moment came during a theatrical performance at the Palatine Games. While the crowd was distracted by music and blood sports, Caligula stepped into a private passage under the theatre to leave the stage. That's where Chaerea and his co-conspirators were waiting, and then they struck. Caligula was stabbed once, then again, and again, over 30 times in some accounts. His guards didn't step in, Some may have even joined in. After all, this was the guy who once made them race chariots dressed as women, while he threw figs at them. Loyalty had officially left the building. The emperor died at just 28 years old. Proof that absolute power may corrupt, absolutely. But it also doesn't come with a good retirement plan. His body, riddled with blade wounds and soaked in betrayal, was dumped in a shallow grave. Not exactly the send-off he pictured for a living god. Back at the Senate, the mood was somewhere between relief and open champagne. For the first time in years, Rome could breathe without checking for dagger-shaped shadows. One senator reportedly described the atmosphere as like removing a raccoon from the cockpit of a spaceship. In other words, we were going down anyway, but at least now someone else could hold the steering wheel. But the celebration was short-lived, because if Rome had learned anything, it was this: killing the mad emperor doesn't kill the madness. The city teetered on the edge of chaos. Power vacuums don't stay empty for long, and the people were already getting anxious. There were rumors of revolts, whispers of civil war, and most importantly, a survivor. Caligula's uncle, the stammering, twitchy, half-forgotten Claudius, was found hiding behind a curtain in the palace. No, really, a literal curtain. When the assassins found him, he was reportedly trembling and expecting a blade. Instead, they declared him emperor, because nothing says smooth political transition like plucking a terrified academic out of a drapery. Claudius, to his credit, cleaned up much of the mess. He stabilized the empire, restored some sanity, and reintroduced laws that didn't involve public humiliation or horse promotions. But even he couldn't erase the legend of Caligula, because Caligula didn't just die, he entered mythology. He became the go-to example of tyranny gone nuclear. His name would echo for centuries as a warning. This is what happens when you give unchecked power to a man with delusions of godhood, zero empathy, and too much time near the incense burner. Was he mad? Was it an act? Was it an illness? Inherited trauma? Or just a bored sociopath with daddy issues and a flair for performance art? Historians still debate it, but one thing is clear: Caligula made history not by building it, but by absolutely setting it on fire, dancing in the ashes, and declaring himself king of the moon. And though Rome moved on, reformed and rebuilt, a part of the empire never quite stopped twitching, because once you've had an emperor who turned the palace into a nightclub, declared war on the sea, and made a horse a public official, it's hard to ever feel truly safe again.